dear fathers, deacons, religious brothers and sisters, and seminarians, distinguished speakers, physicians, and nurses, spectators on Catholic TV, friends all, peace be with you. What a great joy to stand before you today as I welcome you to our symposium, Science Embraces Humanae Vitae. It is an historic event we have looked forward to, and I want to thank the Lord and Pope St. Paul VI for being the cause of our presence here today at St. Agnes Church. As we begin today's program, I want to thank the Lord for the gift of life and of love, for the gift of Humanae Vitae. When we say Humanae Vitae, we expect to hear about human life, about human love, and about human sexuality. Humanae Vitae is a truth tsunami, sign of contradiction, a courageous prophecy in its formulating and developing concepts of moral teaching in the Catholic Church about the beauty of human life and married love. Everything in Humanae Vitae is about love and life, about morality and marriage, about love and commitment. Science embraces Humanae Vitae. So, do we call on science, which is the empirical world of facts and of evidence, to embrace and welcome Humanae Vitae, the formal position on Catholic moral values and principles? Are we able to convince our scientific world today and welcome it into communion with us, which is a visible, tangible, human divine community of life and of love? Today, we try to find a link between two separate worlds: science, which deals with what we can and cannot do, with the moral, what we should or should not do. Basically, we don't get our moral values from science. We welcome it as far as science supports our moral positions. We are not looking to science to change or to modify the truth revealed in Humanae Vitae. The truth doesn't change. Christ is the truth. And the truth professed by the Church, by Pope St. Paul VI in 1968, remains true today with us and after us, as long as the Church lives, forever. Once science supports a moral position, then we can dialogue with our religions or with the non-religious people called today, I quote, the nones, N-O-N-E-S. We can open wide the door of our church to reach all kinds of people from every corner of the earth and talk and use a universal language, telling the world that our church or the Catholic position is not mute, is not deaf, is not blind, but can speak the language of facts and empirical evidence that our position is supported by science. Humanae Vitae is based on science, on different scientific documents prepared by many scientists and physicians who disagreed with the Pope. The Pope finally published his encyclical, telling the world about the 4 basic points of Catholic doctrine and expressing the true design of human procreation. First, a total vision of the human person. Second, the sacrament of marriage. Third, conjugal love, and responsible parenthood, and finally, the Church's teaching on sexuality. The Church's teaching authority, or the magisterium of the Church, is a magisterium of authority and not of science. In other words, it is not a scientific magisterium, it is one of authority. The Pope interprets the divine law, or also the natural law written in our hearts, teaching that its observance is binding on all of us, on all those who are created in the image and likeness of God. In the history of thought, scientific paradigms have changed, and those changes have forced philosophers and theologians to reformulate their understanding of physical reality. In recent times, as science has not only formed man's fundamental perceptions of reality, but its technology has invented various means of manipulating the biological process expressed in sexual intercourse. Because of this, the magisterium has found it necessary to reiterate the Church's position on sexual morality. Essential to that understanding of sexual morality is the insistence on the inviolate inseparability of the procreative and unitive aspects of the marital act. The Church sees the human being not as an abstract nature, not as a mere individual, not as a biological nature, but as a person, one endowed with freedom. Yet, freedom is not arbitrary, it's subject to truth and value. The truth expressed by the Church's teachings does not change because the Church possesses a certitude beyond all scientific hypotheses. The Church knows God, the infinite persons, one and triune. She knows the love of Christ, God made man, and knows that love is a reality even in a world of sin. She knows that the one absolute in time is the love of God manifested in the flesh in and through human nature. God's creative love has affected or influenced human freedom, capable of responding to that love since man is created in God's image. Hence, there must be a relation between love and nature, between personal freedom and nature. Since God is good, there is no ultimate disharmony between love and nature, between morals and science, between Humanae Vitae and science. The flesh is not opposed to the spirit, and both are not opposed to freedom. Since human nature involves biological processes, and those processes are included in physical expressions of love, they were meant to reflect and support the structure of love in freedom. Church doctrine is not based on physics, certainly not on technology. It's based on incarnate love, which alone can preserve the meaning of reality. God's life is love, and the expression of human sexual love was and is inherently linked to life. Sex is not for itself, but for love and for life. The physical, spiritual union of love that is marriage finds its consistent expression in children rightly considered God's wonderful gift. Brothers and sisters, science embraces Humanae Vitae. At the end of our symposium, we hope, with a full trust in our speakers, saying that 50 years after its publication, Humanae Vitae has been vindicated by science. We hope. All our speakers are going to feed us with their theological, spiritual, and scientific knowledge and wisdom. May our reflection on Pope St. Paul VI encyclical Humanae Vitae lead couples and Christian communities to be pro-family and pro-life, and of course, and above all, pro-God. Thank you, and God bless you all. Welcome to St. Agnes.
Thank you so much, Father Charbel. Thank you for those words of truth that we're going to focus on today from the church. Truth does not change. And thank you for your leadership here at St. Agnes. You know, in the encyclical Humanae Vitae, there are a number of appeals, pleadings by Pope St. Paul VI. And one of those is to pastors and to bishops. And he pleads, "Devote yourselves with all zeal and without delay to safeguarding the holiness of marriage, to guide married life to its full human and Christian perfection. Consider this mission as one of your most urgent responsibilities," back in 1968. Both Father Charbel and our next presenter has done that. They've responded to Pope St. Paul VI's pleadings and appeal. Our next presenter, Father Todd Lloyd, is pastor of Immaculate Conception in Lakeland, just west of here. And he, too, is one who has taken his pastorship and his priesthood and been a beacon to the holiness of marriage and guiding married life to its full human and Christian perfection. Please welcome Father Todd Lloyd.
You know, every year at my parish, during the high school retreat for Parish School of Religion, my students are given the opportunity to ask questions anonymously if they want on paper, which I'll try my best to answer. The questions, for the most part, fall under the same subjects every year, and you probably could all tell me what those subjects are: evil and suffering, heaven and hell, and of course, sex. This year, there was, for the first time, a question that succinctly encapsulated the issues that the young people usually raise. And the question was, and I quote, "Father, why is the church so traditional? It's 2018, you know?" This question is at the heart of many of the criticisms of the Catholic Church, including the topic of today of artificial birth control. As with many things, it is widely believed that the Church's moral teaching about contraception is behind the times. It's old-fashioned, it's out of touch. This opinion is based largely on the common idea that was obvious in my students' question about it being 2018, you know, that we are now, as a society, further advanced than the generations before us, thanks in large part to science. The social sciences have revealed human person to us better than ever before. The medical sciences have unlocked the secrets of the human body. The technological sciences have empowered us to do things that once were thought to be fantasy. But the Church's teaching on contraception, voiced strongly and to some surprisingly by Pope Paul in Humanae Vitae, seems to ignore and even condemn those sociological or medical or technological advances. What I think we will learn today from the speakers following me is that Pope Paul's message in Humanae Vitae, upholding the Church's constant teaching, is not behind the advancements of the world, but that the Church has been ahead of the world for a long time, and legitimate sciences of the world are finally catching up, thanks in large part to Paul VI's call on the sciences. Before we see how that call is courageously being responded to by many in the healthcare, scientific, and legal fields, we first need to maybe see how the world's idea of regulating birth is not as novel an idea as widely believed, and how the progressive mindset has been held not by the world, but by the Church, culminating especially in Humanae Vitae's invitation to the scientific communities. The common idea and desire of regulating births artificially is not, as I said, new. It's not an idea that started in the last 2 centuries or even the last 2 millenniums, nor is it something that only recently became possible thanks to inventions like intrauterine devices or the oral contraceptions of the 50s and 60s. Rather, the earliest evidence we have of this so-called revolution goes back to 1850 BC. There are ancient Egyptian documents describing different methods and substances to inhibit fertility. For instance, one North African herb called silphium is mentioned in some texts as to have had such a great contraceptive quality that the demand for it led to its extinction in the 3rd or 2nd century BC. And from that time on, throughout history, including even in Christian Catholic Europe, there are countless proofs that couples sought and discovered ways to avoid pregnancy during sex, whether it be withdrawal or barrier or herbal. Of course, some of those methods were superstitious and many of them were not reliable. Nonetheless, it is safe to say that human beings have been wanting to and finding ways to contracept long before the Church ever said not to. And this is the point. The Church's teaching is not the older of the 2 ideas, but the newer. Where people of the world have always and everywhere wanted to have sex without the risk of pregnancy, the Church is proposing a new and different idea, one that asks a real progressive question. When there is a legitimate reason why you might want to regulate birth, why not do so according to nature? Rather than trying to subvert nature, why not collaborate with it? This proposal, which has come mostly in the form of condemnation of artificial means, has been the position of the Church since the beginning. This is important to understand because it makes clear that what Pope Paul VI says is not the opinion of one man or by any means a new teaching of the Church in response to a new problem. The issues of regulating births was not a new problem in the 60s, and therefore neither was the Church's teaching made up just then. Just a brief look at the Church's teaching throughout history shows that Pope Paul was standing on a strong foundation of Christian thought when he wrote Humanae Vitae and called on the world to try something new. For example, the 2nd century apology of St. Justin Martyr describes the marital problems of a young converted Christian woman whose pagan husband wanted to have conjugal love, quote, against the law of nature and against what is right. And Justin Martyr praised her for refusing to cooperate with her husband's unnatural desires. St. Clement of Alexandria, also of the 2nd century, affirmed the good of the marital embrace, but he strongly warns against doing so only for the sake of pleasure. He wrote, "Marriage in itself merits esteem and of the highest approval, for the Lord wishes for men to be fruitful and multiply." But he did not tell them to act like libertines, nor did he intend them to surrender themselves to pleasure as though born only to indulge in relations. Why, even unreasoning beasts know enough not to mate at certain times. The famous scripture scholar, church father, and doctor of the church, St. Jerome, wrote about a form of chemical contraception, in a sense, popular in his day, over 1,600 years ago, when he said that some impure women who, quote, drink potions to ensure sterility and are guilty of murdering a human being not yet even conceived. Another doctor of the church from the same era, St. John Chrysostom, preached in a sermon about what extents the greedy, those who have avarice, will go to avoid having a child to care for. He said they maimed their nature, not only by slaying their children after birth, but not even agreeing to conceive. In other words, they mutilate themselves in order to make sure they don't even conceive. The very famous St. Augustine, who admittedly knew something about struggling with chastity in his life, reflected on St. Paul's teaching about marriage when he wrote that some married couples defile their marriage when they engage in intercourse, but, he says, conception of offspring is avoided intentionally. And then he references the book of Genesis when he says, Onan, the son of Judah, did this very thing, and the Lord slew him on that account. Therefore, and this line is very important, the procreation of children is itself the primary, natural, legitimate purpose of marriage. This sentiment, this teaching of St. Augustine would be one that is repeated again and again, that procreation is the first reason why conjugal love exists. If we skip forward, we'd find affirmation of these early church fathers. For instance, in the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas said that use of poisonous drugs for sterility is a grave sin and to be classified as a crime and against nature. In 1588, Pope Sixtus V also issued a statement on the matter, asking who finally would not condemn with the most severe punishments the crimes of those who, by poisons, potions, and evil drugs, induce sterility in women, so that they might not conceive, or by means of evil working medication, that they might not give birth. And moving forward, finally into the 20th century, we find the same line of thought in for instance, 1930s, Pope Pius XI wrote that the conjugal act is of its very nature designed for the procreation of offspring. And therefore, those who, in performing deliberately, deprive it of its natural power and efficacy, act against nature, and do something which is shameful and intrinsically immoral. And 35 years after that, the Second Vatican Council offered the same reflection in Gaudium et Spes, which says, by their very nature, the institution of matrimony itself and conjugal love are ordained for the procreation and education of children, and find in them their ultimate crown. The crown jewels of marriage and conjugal love is fertility. I'll stop giving specific examples now, only because it would take way too long if we covered all of them throughout the history of the church. But the point is clear. The church's teaching on this matter has been constant and unchanging, which reveals ultimately two things for us. First, the modern desire and ability to contracept today is not new, it is old as any other sin. So people's embrace of it today has nothing to do with being up to date or progressive. The only thing that is new is the increased effectiveness and efficiency in contraceptive techniques. But becoming more proficient in something doesn't justify that activity. For instance, we have also become a lot more efficient at murder in the last 2 centuries. But that doesn't mean that murder is now progressive and no longer a moral evil. The second important revelation in seeing the constant teaching of the church is that it shows Paul's teaching is not his own, but that of the churches. This is important, at least for Catholics, because this makes it a binding teaching that we are obliged to believe, not only thanks to all of the very rational and philosophical, natural, theological arguments given throughout the ages, but precisely because it has been given throughout the ages. It is a part of the deposit of faith. Pope Pius XI said this 30 years before Humanae Vitae was written, when he explained that this teaching is a doctrine that cannot be departed from because it is a part of the constant Christian teaching handed down uninterruptedly from the beginning. And so the church has the task, he says, of teaching and preserving morals and right conduct in their integrity, and the integrity as they have been taught constantly. Neither the year nor the circumstances can change what is true or untrue, right or wrong. And what was a moral evil 2,000 years ago is still a moral evil today. So I suppose then 2 questions might now be raised. Why did this well-established teaching need to be restated again by Paul VI? And what, if anything, is different about Humanae Vitae? The long history of humanity's desire for reliable contraception reached, as we all know, something of a crescendo in the middle of the 20th century. Proponents of artificial birth control provided the social and economic support needed to produce and then finally legalize oral contraception in the 1960s. While with the sexual revolution in full swing, this new pill was being embraced by many as a means to finally liberate sex from the shackles of procreation. As the public demand grew, it became widely accepted by governments and even religions of the world, almost every Christian denomination eventually. The questions for the church started with whether or not the use of this new medical technology to intentionally avoid pregnancy was a violation of the church's already commitment to the primacy of openness to life and conjugal love. And then the questions multiplied from there. Perhaps the most important one was, if the pill is found to be contrary to the teaching, then can the church's teaching change? So in 1963, Pope Paul established the Pontifical Commission for the Study of Problems of the Family, Population, and Birth Rate. A very good name for Pontifical Commission. In recognition that more and more Catholics were asking whether the new drugs might be used. The Papal Commission was eventually expanded to include 72 members from all over the world, including bishops and cardinals and theologians, doctors, and even married couples. One of its members, famously, was a bishop of Poland named Karol Wojtyła, future Pope John Paul II. For 3 years, this commission examined and studied the issues, but members were ultimately divided. Eventually, in 1966, they produced 2 reports, a majority and a minority report. The majority spoke very much kind of in the vein of what the world desired, of the need to change the church's teaching. But the minority held that there could not be a change, and that use of the pill for contraceptive purposes was indeed a contradiction to the moral teaching. It took another 2 years of study and prayer. Pope Paul wrote about how later that this was the most heavy burden that he had found, making this decision of writing Humanae Vitae. But after 2 years of that prayer and reflection, in 1968, Pope Paul VI published his encyclical letter on human life. The encyclical is broken into three sections. The first section acknowledges that in the modern era, there seems to be developments and struggles that provoke new questions. Issues like the population of the world, issues like economic concerns for individual families. In short, these questions that most importantly are raised out of these issues are these. Can the teaching of the church change? Does every single sexual act have to be open to life, or is it licit to regulate and plan the family size by taking actions to render certain acts infertile while still being open to having children in the marriage in general? And does the requirement for responsible procreation make it licit to regulate procreation at all? He proceeds to answer these questions in the second section, and he gives the doctrinal principles behind the church's teaching. First, to the first question, is it possible for the church's teaching to change? As we have already seen, and therefore, not surprisingly, the church's teaching cannot change. And Pope Paul explains it, the reason for this, in very simple terms. It's not true because the church teaches it, but the church has taught it because it is true. Widespread dissent or disagreement is not a reason to change the church's teaching, because it is not hers to change. Rather, this law comes from the design of God for marriage and sexuality, which is evident in both the Gospels and in nature. He says, quote, "Since the church did not make either of these laws, that is the gospel or nature, she cannot be their arbiter, only their guardian and interpreter. It could never be right for her to declare lawful what is in fact unlawful, since that by its very nature is always opposed to the true good of man." Secondly, to the second question, it is never licit to intentionally impede the procreative element of conjugal love, even in single instances, even if the marriage as a whole is open to life. The reason for this is a pretty simple moral principle that I found to be similar to one that we all learned as children. We all learned as children that two wrongs don't make a right. Well, Pope Paul explains the principle is similar, that a single wrong action is not made good just because it is accompanied by several good actions. Conjugal love, by its very nature, as we've heard, is designed by God, intended for procreation, and therefore to intentionally disturb this element is contrary to God's design. And as we can never directly intend to do moral evil, not even as a means to an end that we perceive to be good. Another simple principle, that the ends never justify the means. And so the pontiff wrote, "It is a serious error to think that a whole married life of otherwise normal relations can justify sexual intercourse which is deliberately contraceptive and so intrinsically wrong." Based on these natural Christian doctrines of marriage and sex, the Pope goes on to clearly state what is morally condemned. He gives 4 of them. It is morally condemned: direct interruption of the sexual act in order to avoid insemination, direct abortion, direct sterilization of either the man or the woman, and finally, any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation. Thirdly, the last question of the encyclical is whether or not it is possible to regulate at all in any way. The Church supports the use of human intellect in making advances in creation, but this must be done in cooperation with the Creator's design, not in opposition to it. If there are legitimate reasons for avoiding pregnancy, either for health or external circumstances such as serious economic concerns, then married people may, by the use of their human intellect and discipline, engage in intercourse, quote, during those times that are infertile, Pope Paul VI says. As we'll hear today, thanks to scientific progress, we have come to better understand the reproductive cycles, which Pope Paul says we can take advantage of. While some may consider this maybe to be a little inconsistent, the Pope explains that using the faculty of human intellect to cooperate with nature to achieve the desired result of limiting procreation is completely different from obstructing the natural development of the generative process. Abstaining from sex during fertile periods is in no way the moral equivalent as using chemicals to make sexual acts sterile. The former is using the human intellect and discipline to achieve the good of cooperating with the nature through periodic abstinence. The latter misuses the intellect, driven by a lack of discipline, to deform nature. He concludes that second section, which is mostly doctrinal, with an important and beautiful teaching that is often referred to as the prophecy of Pope Paul VI. His predictions of what would be the consequences of widespread use of artificial birth control. First, he explains how it could lead to more marital infidelity and a general lowering of moral standards, because human weakness does require motivation to keep the moral law. In other words, the possibility of fertility causes people to live chastely, and to remove that will increase immorality. Perhaps we can ask ourselves, has that happened today? Another effect is that as sex and procreation become separate in the mind and practice of men, they may begin to lose respect for women, treating them as objects of their sexual desire rather than as persons deserving of care and affection. Perhaps to maybe reference a very popular issue today, we can ask ourselves if the spread of contraception is to blame for the so-called the Me Too movement that we are seeing today. And he also foresaw governments becoming tempted to use artificial birth control as a means to resolve social and national problems. Most certainly, we have seen that in places like China, but also there are certainly some motions and movements to do that here in our day too. Finally, in the third and final section of the encyclical, Pope Paul gives the pastoral directives of how this perennial Christian doctrine might be promoted and applied in the modern era. He directs comments, as we have already heard, towards individual families and social and government leaders, priests and bishops, and of course, science and medical professionals. The Holy Father called upon them to do all in their power to use science and medicine in service of God's plan and for the good of God's people. This is the real Catholic approach to science, isn't it? Authentic Christianity is a pro-science religion because we believe that the God who created the universe did so in an ordered way, fashioned on laws, and that he even entered that universe by the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, definitively showing us that the material world is not intrinsically evil or chaotic, but is created by God as objectively good, to be discovered and studied by the human intellect as the rational means to know him better. For this reason, the Church is historically one of the greatest patrons of science, including being the source of universities and institutional scientific research that helped ultimately produce much of the unprecedented scientific advancement that we have seen in the West over the last 2,000 years. In fact, some of those most important scientific figures in history were clergymen. Pope Paul's invitation ultimately reveals what the Church considers the vocation of science to be and not to be. Science's vocation is to make legitimate advancement in, and this is the key point, advancement in understanding and utilizing the nature of creation for the benefit of man. Science's vocation is not to seek out ways to undermine and even break the nature of creation. The vocation, then, of medical science is to discover ways to heal our nature when it is unwell. It is not to discover ways to combat our nature. And fertility is a sign of health for an adult human person, not a sign of illness. It does not need to be combated or cured. When we look back on antiquity and see attempts to break nature, we often call that superstition. We marvel at how they could mutilate themselves or consume substances that did harm to their person, all because they thought it was achieving something good. For instance, the very common practice of bloodletting for almost any type of illness, and even used as a regular therapy to maintain good health, or the use of mercury, both as an ointment and to be ingested, to be drunk, as a means to increase lifespan and vitality. What it really was doing is making people go insane and die. Thankfully, most practices like these have passed away, but one age-old superstition still exists: the idea that we should take potions to subdue healthy fertility. Pope Paul continues the tradition of the Church, being a benefactor of progressive science, by calling on the scientific communities to finally break from the superstitious and unnatural ideas that treat healthy fertility as a disease. Humanae Vitae challenges scientific endeavor to better understand human fertility, to discover the best conditions when necessary for natural regulation of birth. Thankfully, the answer of this call has not only helped us to better regulate birth in cooperation with nature, but as we're going to hear, it has also been a real driving force for progressive understanding and remedying fertility complications. He also specifically calls on Christian healthcare professionals, doctors and nurses, to first fulfill their obligation as Christians to God, to be morally upright people before they appease the expectations of those around them, their coworkers or even their patients. They must serve God first in what they do. They must form their consciences properly and allow the faith and right reason to motivate the way they care for their patients. Since fertility is a good of health and not a nuisance, healthcare workers ought to help and advise their patients to respect the nature of their bodies. It's untrue, if someone were to say this, to suggest that doctors or nurses are in no position to advise their patients to appreciate their own fertility and to accept the challenge, to challenge them, to practice discipline and abstinence rather than seeking easy modes of artificial birth control. We all know that doctors have no problem telling us to appreciate and accept challenges, the challenge of a good diet, regular exercise. If my physician can tell me what to eat and how to exercise instead of trying quick and unhealthy diets or miracle drugs that promise to shed off the pounds, then most certainly, why can fertility doctors not tell their patients to periodically abstain instead of using pills that destroy healthy fertility? One of these is real care for health. The other is haphazard quick fix for weak willpower. In conclusion, our society is one that loves the idea of novelty and progress. And as Christians, we can honestly say on this issue, thanks to the upholding and promotion of the teachings of Humanae Vitae, that we are ahead of the world, not behind it. The truth of Jesus Christ sets us free from the old notions of antiquity, which presumes that human beings are incapable of discipline and abstinence, and so must deform fertility. He comes to make all things new, and that includes our understanding of human nature so that we might cooperate with it rather than treat it as an adversary. It is time to stop treating healthy fertility as a problem and instead embrace it as a good, as the good that it is. And this is the real novelty, to ask what is new or different about Humanae Vitae. This is the real novelty of Pope Paul's message in that encyclical. While he upheld the constant teaching of the Church, he did present it in a nuanced way, where previous iterations, as those that we heard in a little while ago, as those previous iterations were negative in tone, Pope Paul tried to present the teaching from a positive point of view. He later explained that his aim in Humanae Vitae was not just a declaration about a negative moral law. It is above all a positive presentation of conjugal morality in relation to its mission of love and fruitfulness. It's not about what you can't do. His message of Humanae Vitae is not a thou shalt not, but rather it's about what you can do. It's about the love and the gift of God in fertility and about embracing that and working with it. It is a positive teaching. Fertility is the greatest good of married love and sexuality, not a curse. So with Pope St. Paul, we are, as the Church, in the position to say to the world, to the scientific and medical communities, it is time for you to catch up with us. After all, it is 2018, you know? The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
You know, the Church has been ahead of the world for a long time, and science is merely catching up. You know, his call for us to collaborate with nature. That the Church's teaching is the real deal. It's actually the progressive idea in response to the challenges of man. Real care for health, and to stop treating healthy fertility as a problem. Fertility as the greatest good of married life. And yet widespread dissension does not permit the Church to not tell the truth. You know, Father Todd talked about the call or the appeal to doctors and nurses and highlighted the words of St. Paul VI within the Humanae Vitae. Doctors and nurses should regard it as an essential part of their skill to make themselves fully proficient in this difficult field of medical knowledge. For then, when married couples ask for their advice, they may be in a position to give them right counsel and to point them in the proper direction. After all, married couples have a right to expect this much from them. Our next presenter is one who has responded to that appeal. In 1994, Dr. Kim Hardy moved his OBGYN practice from Dothan, Alabama, to Lafayette, Louisiana, and he basically opened a totally pro-life OBGYN practice. And certainly Lafayette, Greater Lafayette, and Louisiana as a whole has certainly benefited from that. You know, Dr. Hardy goes on a national basis, speaks nationally on the topic, and that's a big deal. But for so many women and families in South Louisiana, he's a phone call away, or they've actually traveled hours to go see him. And so that's really been such a huge benefit and consolation for so many. So please join me in welcoming a man of courage, a man of compassion, a man of incredible wisdom, Dr. Kim Hardy.
I was asked to talk about the evidence supporting the effectiveness of fertility awareness-based methods in responsible parenthood. And I also added to discuss the physiology of human reproduction and an overview of the different methods of natural family planning. This conference is a great event to celebrate this Humanae Vitae encyclical, now 50 years old, and I wanted to thank the two priests who did a great job in their presentations that preceded me. This PowerPoint was done by two pioneers in natural family planning, and I wanted to give them credit. Richard Faring's a nurse, PhD, who invented the Marquette method, which truly was opening up new technological approaches to make natural family planning easier and more effective. And Dr. Kathleen Ravielli, who lives in Atlanta, Georgia, and for about 30 years has also been an NFP-only OBGYN. This slide says, what do you think of when you hear the term natural family planning? Well, for myself, as going through marriage prep 41 years ago, I thought it meant pregnancies and big families. And as it turns out, after my careful study of it, it's a highly effective way of child spacing that respects the natural order and potentially builds strong marriages. You notice I did not say natural family planning was easy, particularly in a culture that makes contraception so tempting. But I'm convinced that the struggle of natural family planning is so important in the growth of virtue of married couples. What do you hope for in your marriage? I think everyone on the planet is seeking happiness. And of course, if you're going to be married, you'd like to think that it would also be full of joy and great love. But I think most of us miss a point that I missed as an engaged person, is that in the Catholic Church's vision, marriage is a sacrament. And a sacrament is an outward sign given to us to provide grace, to help each other over the many years of marriage to recognize our defects and to grow in holiness. And I believe this is a foreign concept in the world today, that marriage has any other purpose other than a social contract. Now, these are the objectives of my talk. We're going to define what natural family planning is. We're going to describe how natural family planning works. We're going to discuss the effectiveness of the different natural family planning methods, and then summarize the benefits of using natural family planning. Now, starting with the definition of natural family planning, it's a method of monitoring and interpreting natural biological markers of fertility. And you notice a key word that's not in there is interrupting. Contraceptives are methods of achieving the same end, the regulation of fertility, but by interrupting the natural reproductive processes. Natural family planning works with nature and is based, as we're going to show you, on sound science. Secondly, it's to help determine the fertile and infertile times of a woman's menstrual cycle. It's a basic principle that men are always fertile, women only for a short time each month. And so natural family planning tries to identify this fertile period so the couple can choose to abstain or to use their marital act, depending upon whether they're trying to seek or avoid a pregnancy. And thirdly, this information can be used to achieve or avoid a pregnancy, and particularly advances have been made using the Creighton model of natural family planning, which Dr. Chassik's going to discuss later in his talk. Now, natural family planning also means inherently a period of abstinence. Abstaining from intercourse and genital activity during the fertile time of a cycle if a couple's trying to avoid pregnancy. Typically, for most couples, this involves at least 7 to 11 days of abstinence each cycle. It also suggests not using contraception to interfere with fertility. Some couples would chart their natural family planning signs, and if they thought they were fertile, use a barrier method or withdrawal to try to avoid a pregnancy. Natural family planning instead encourages self-mastery, self-control, learning to control our sexual impulses during the times of fertility. To do this, we have to develop non-genital ways of expressing intimacy during these fertile times. This includes acts of service, recreation, some contraceptive couples only use the sexual act for intimacy. And I think recent developments in things like love languages, understanding how couples really communicate, are necessary for couples who do natural family planning to see how they can truly love each other without the physical contact that contraception normalizes all the time. Lastly on this is being open to life. The church does not say that we always have to seek a baby, but if we take chances or ignore signs of fertility, we must accept the possibility that a baby may be a normal outcome of that sexual act and part of God's will. This openness to life is actually the antidote to abortion, which contraception propagates. Now, these are the different commonly thought of methods of natural family planning. The first two, calendar rhythm and the basal body temperature, have fallen into disuse. They were either cumbersome or not very effective. But the third three, the cervical mucus or ovulation method, usually you may have heard of this as the Billings or the Creighton models, which rely on cervical mucus, are highly effective modern methods of natural family planning. Lafayette uses historically more of the simple thermal method. Y'all may have heard of the couple-to-couple league, which uses both temperature and cervical mucus observations to identify the fertile time. This new, rather new, the last 10 years or so, this hormonal monitoring is very helpful for serious reasons to use natural family planning. And in Lafayette, I've had some heroic, courageous couples who had serious reasons to avoid a pregnancy, like heart disease in the mother or a high risk of birth defects and stillborns, that led couples to use these hormonal methods, which in my experience have been nearly 100% effective for highly motivated couples. So how does natural family planning work? We're going to talk about some of the science today, which is the same science that you'll read about in obstetrics and gynecology journals, that medical students and pre-medical students learn, that natural family planning is based on observations of what normally goes on in a woman's menstrual cycle. Now, we consider a woman to have a 6-day fertile window. What that means that in the presence of normal cervical mucus, which we'll talk about soon, sperm can live for about 5 days. The woman's egg at the time of ovulation only remains fertile for about 24 hours. So if we can identify this 6-day window and avoid intercourse during that time, we should be able to avoid pregnancy. In practicality, a few days are added to make the methods as effective as possible. If you're not familiar with natural family planning, this chart shows the different phases of a menstrual cycle. That red block it'll be your left side, is during menses. And after the menstrual period is over, a woman typically has about 4 days where she's still infertile, and that's that small green block. The blue phase is the very fertile phase, and this is the time of peak cervical mucus production. And then after a woman ovulates, if you remember I said the egg only lives 24 hours, most couples have about a 12-day green block in which they're not fertile. And natural family planning uses these observations so couples can identify these times. Now, this shows you why the old rhythm method did not work very well. In each one of these blocks, you can see that the red is still the menstrual cycle, or should I say the menstrual period, but then the size of the green block between the end of the menstrual period and the onset of the fertile period varies from month to month. In the top set, the woman has an infertile time only from day 5 to day 10, then her normal fertile time, and then ends up having about a 29-day cycle. In the second, the woman has a very short infertile time after her menstrual period, and so ovulation becomes much earlier. Her fertile time moves up closer, but then she has a very short menstrual cycle in which she has her period start on about day 26. The third example shows a woman on her period then has infertility from day 5 to about day 16 and ovulates very late, which gives her a longer menstrual cycle and delays her period for about 35 days. So it's this type of variation that is normal in human health that makes the observations of the signs of fertility so imperative for couples who feel they have a legitimate reason to avoid pregnancy. Now, many of you may not have looked at anatomy in quite some time. The way God made the female reproductive anatomy is quite remarkable as a common observer. If you can see, the vagina, of course, is the lowest organ below the cervix. The corpus of the uterus or body is the main portion. And you can see, I don't know from where you're sitting, but the lining of the uterus develops each month, preparing for a possible conception. And it's under the influence of hormones that this happens each menstrual cycle. Most women have ovaries, one on each side, and fallopian tubes, which the ovaries are the organs that provide an egg each month, and the fallopian tube is the transport organ that brings the egg, once fertilized, down to the uterus in the cycles that she becomes pregnant. Now, this is a female cervix, very important for natural family planning. You'll notice that the lower part of the cervix has glands that secrete mucus each month. And in natural family planning, we take advantage of what nature gives us. Each month, under the influence of estrogen, a woman's cervix starts to make a mucousy discharge that she observes during normal bathroom visits. And it's the observation of this mucus that helps a couple decide when they are and when they are not potentially fertile. When there's no fertile mucus present, sperm are thought to live for very short periods of time, maybe less than an hour. Whereas once that mucus that's clear and stretchy, resembles egg white, is present, sperm can live in this type of mucus for 3 to 5 days. So identifying this mucus is critical to a couple's natural family planning observations. Once a woman ovulates, she makes a second hormone called progesterone. I like that word, progestation. If you have trouble remembering it, it's a hormone a woman makes each month in case she becomes pregnant. And that hormone, of course, stays high during the whole course of a pregnancy to help carry the pregnancy. Pregnancies with low progesterone frequently miscarry or have premature labor. This is the ovary, which is one of the smartest organs in the body, in my opinion. You can see all the way to the right by that red blood vessel. Each month, when a woman starts her period, she starts to develop small follicles, each one potentially becoming an egg that will fully develop to release about 2 weeks after the onset of her period in most cycles. And you can see that once the egg is released, she forms a small cyst called the corpus luteum, which begins to make progesterone to regulate her bleeding and also her pregnancy should she become pregnant. This is ingenious, and only someone who believes in God can understand this. It would seem that this alone would be enough to make one believe in God by its very existence. Now, we use natural family planning observations that are based on certain hormones that are normally made in by a woman throughout her menstrual cycle. The first one is estrogen. Estrogen levels are very low when a woman's on her period. About 5 to 7 days later, these levels start to go up, and it's secreted by the ovary in preparation for ovulation, and it's estrogen that makes a woman's cervix start to produce mucus. So as a woman is observing for the initiation of this mucus observation in her bathroom visits, she is directly measuring, or I guess indirectly measuring, the presence of estrogen that's being secreted from her ovary. LH is a hormone that is secreted by the pituitary, and it's the rise in the level of estrogen stimulates her pituitary to make a large amount of this LH, or luteinizing hormone, which causes the release of the egg. It is this LH hormone that women use when they check their urine measurements for fertility, because you can recognize in urinary measurements this surge in LH, which tells a woman when she's fertile if she's trying to get pregnant. It's also somewhat useful in certain methods to try to avoid a pregnancy, identifying this LH. And lastly, progesterone is secreted by that small cyst on the ovary, the corpus luteum, each month when a woman ovulates. And it does two things that are helpful in natural family planning. It raises a woman's basal body temperature, and it also dries up her cervical mucus. Certain methods use this by temperature observations. Many of them rely only on mucus, and we'll talk about that very soon. So natural family planning uses natural biological signs of fertility in its observations. It can be observed by measuring the changes in the resting body temperature, changes in cervical mucus, and also these changes in the female hormones that we just talked about. This is a schematic commonly used in physiology classes, where you can see the menstrual cycle by charting daily the levels of the 4 common female hormones. And you can see all the way to the left would be where a woman is on her menstrual period, and the levels are very low. That yellow line shows that surge in estrogen that makes her cervix produce mucus, and also triggers the rise in LH, that's the green line on the slide above it, on the chart above it, which causes a release of the egg. Once the egg is released, she starts to make progesterone, which is that blue line. You can see progesterone levels are very, very low in the first half of the menstrual cycle, but rise precipitously right after ovulation. And it is that rise in progesterone that dries up a woman's mucus and also makes her temperature rise if a couple is using their temperature as a signs of proving ovulation has occurred. Again, the point of this slide, don't memorize it, but it's to see the beauty of God's creation, and also to see how these natural family planning observations are based on sound science. All we're doing is teaching couples to observe the changes in a woman's body that occur every month because of the changes that are going on inside her physiology without her even thinking about it. Okay, so as a woman observes the signs of fertility, she is at a time, of course, after her period's over. She has several days where she sees no mucus. She begins observing for signs of the presence of this mucus. It is the first observation of mucus discharge from the cervix that tells her that she has started her fertile phase. This can also be measured by measuring rising levels of the hormone estrogen, which predict that ovulation is about to occur. Now, there are ways to identify the most fertile days as peak fertility. One is the presence of very clear, stretchy, slippery mucus, and also by a rise in the basal body temperature if a couple is using a temperature measurement to aid in their observations. And also, as I mentioned, that clear blue fertility monitor, which measures the rise in that hormone LH, which triggers ovulation to tell a woman that they are near peak fertility. So once a woman has seen cervical mucus, she's seen by checking her rise in her LH, she knows ovulation is near, the couple starts to abstain. And then the couple has to determine when the fertile time is over. When are they past ovulation enough that they should not be able to get pregnant? And this can be done by checking noticing the peak day of cervical mucus plus 3 days of decreasing mucus. If you use a temperature-based method, you can check the rise in the temperature for about 3 days. You can measure the urinary LH level peak and count 3 days. and these are the most commonly ways used to determine the end of the fertile phase. Okay, now this is what cervical mucus observations may look like for those of you who've never done natural family planning. You can see the beginning of the cycle, that index finger all the way to the left. I don't see any mucus on there at all. Those would be considered infertile days. As a woman gets closer to ovulation, that next photograph shows what we call tachymucus, mucus that barely stretches, usually is not clear, and this indicates the beginning of the fertile time. By the time a woman reaches her day of ovulation, she'll notice copious amounts of that fluid in the third picture, which is, we call that the most fertile type mucus near peak day. And then once progesterone is produced, the last slide shows the mucus begins to thicken up, the amount gets less, and she knows that she's ovulated. She has to count 3 days of that less fertile mucus to know that she's past ovulation and past her fertile time. This is what a basal body temperature chart looks like. This is used in methods like the Marquette model or the couple-to-couple league natural family planning model, which uses the mucus and also uses the temperature as a secondary sign to give the couple 2 different ways to measure that ovulation has occurred. And you can see that before ovulation, if you remember, I told you progesterone levels are almost 0 in the 1 to 2 range. The temperature is very low. Once the woman ovulates, progesterone causes a natural rise in her temperature, her basal body temperature, which is that blue line after that word biphasic shift. So a woman can see, I've had 3 rising temperatures, and now that we're infertile until we get back around to the pre-ovulation time in the next month. Now, of the methods commonly used in Louisiana, the Billings and Creighton model rely only on mucus, so they never take temperatures. But the couple-to-couple league and the Marquette, as I said, do follow the temperature as a secondary sign. This is a clear blue fertility monitor. It's most commonly used for couples who are trying to get pregnant so they can identify their peak day of fertility to try to make a baby. It's been used as an aid to help with natural family planning, but must be used in conjunction with observations of mucus and/or temperature to make it effective. So, basics about natural family planning, the instructions, that once you've identified your ovulatory or your fertile phase, having intercourse during this fertile time is how you achieve a pregnancy. If you're trying not to make a baby, you're trying to avoid a pregnancy, you never have intercourse during that fertile window. But does natural family planning work? And I think that's really the purpose of my talk. The physiology was to help understand how you go about practicing it. But really the main part that of this talk is to show that through science and through these observations, natural family planning is highly effective for spacing pregnancies. Now, you have to consider, and after 25 years of working with couples trying to do natural family planning, I can tell you this slide is probably the most important one I'll show you. And that is, there's a correct or perfect use of natural family planning, which means that you observe your signs and with discipline and self-control, you avoid intercourse during the fertile time and follow the rules. And we call this perfect use. And unintended pregnancy rates refers to pregnancies that occur when the method is used consistently and according to instructions. I can tell you that the pregnancy rate in couples using the method properly who understand it and act on the signs of fertility, this is extremely effective with very low pregnancy rates. However, I live in Lafayette, Louisiana, where maybe couples are a little more cavalier about their natural family planning, maybe don't take it so serious in many cases, and it's not unusual to have what we call oops babies, where the husband was going offshore, she wasn't too fertile, they thought they'd take a chance because she really was wanting to make him happy, and there's no shock when she's pregnant when he gets back from his 2-week shift offshore. This is called typical use, and the total pregnancy rate includes a combination of unintended pregnancies when the methods are followed correctly and the unintended pregnancies that occur when use of this method do not always follow the instructions or use the method correctly. And so when you understand an effectiveness, you have to understand both ways. In other words, many couples use it perfectly, many couples don't. And it's not fair to compare couples who don't use the method well, don't understand it, haven't been properly instructed, with couples who actually have been trained and are disciplined in their reproductive practices. So this shows the sort of a summary of the effectiveness of natural family planning. When you use just the mucus or just the temperature, those are single index methods, and with perfect use, couples have been able to achieve a 97% effectiveness rate. Again, the typical rate is 84%, which implies that 16% of couples didn't follow the rules that well, didn't make the observations, didn't act on them. If you use a multiple index method, which means observations of mucus or temperature or another sign of fertility like a clear blue monitor, then you can see that perfect use does get a 98% effectiveness. But typical use, again, not abstaining, not following all the rules, drops the effectiveness down to about 90%. Recently, in the literature for medical journals, there have been 3 articles that discuss this. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I think it's important to recognize that the medical communities, although they in general are not great friends of abstinence, natural family planning, we live in a very contraceptive world, pro-contraceptive, pro-sterilization, but they have started to recognize that natural family planning has a role and that there are couples who use it. The first article I just want to mention comes from the Journal of Family Medicine. And what they looked at was the use of fertility apps. This modern world, which I'm not really part of anymore, that uses technology for everything, likes to use apps to do natural family planning. And when they studied the different apps that might be effective, they found that even couples who used the apps, natural family planning was not made more effective unless the couple also took natural family planning training, because most of the apps were not designed to be used for preventing pregnancy. They were used for monitoring the cycle and also to help someone get pregnant. In a very good article in the Osteopathic Family Medicine Journal, they studied the different methods of natural family planning, trying to show other family practitioners that this was a viable method. And they studied the effectiveness of natural family planning in several studies that were used to evaluate the effectiveness. And it returned basically the same effectiveness rates I showed you in that last slide, that you can expect when properly following the method of natural family planning, with the proper technique and proper abstinence, a 98% effectiveness. But with typical use, when the method is not used properly, we can expect that unintended pregnancy rates climb to as high as 16%. And so couples who are going to use the apps or the fertility apps have to be properly trained in using, making natural family planning observations, and also in the necessity of abstinence. Lastly, one journal article from American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which is probably the most liberal organization in the country, supporting every evil we don't believe in obstetrics and gynecology, which I won't go into that. But they actually published an article in a recent journal this year that reviewed several of the different studies who've studied the effectiveness of natural family planning, and found that in most of the studies, the effectiveness was very high when properly used, and again, not as high when couples used their own method or didn't abstain at the proper times. This is a slide that was part of this talk I should have talked about first, and it showed that some of the studies that were done over the past several years, you can see from 1981 all the way to 2007, where they studied different methods of natural family planning, mucus-based methods, calendar rhythm, mucus and temperature, and found that with correct use of any method, that you could achieve anywhere between a 95 to 100% effectiveness rate at avoiding pregnancy. But again, if you include all the people who learn the method a little bit, try to use it, if they're included in the data, people who don't follow the rules, the effectiveness rate drops as low as 86%. Now, this is the pregnancy rate showing the different methods of family planning, not natural family planning. And you can see that even with things like the birth control pill, which is down near the bottom, and the IUD, they have small unintended pregnancy rates. Those methods that require the couple to do something like take a birth control pill have a correct use and also have a typical use. In other words, if they don't take their birth control pills properly, you expect you'll see a higher pregnancy rate than you would if they took them perfectly. And you can see that the three natural family planning methods that are right in the middle in the red have a correct use that is better than, of course, better than chance, better than spermicides or withdrawal and condoms, but not quite as good as the pill or IUD. They have lower typical use pregnancy rates than the spermicides, withdrawal, or condoms. So in essence, what I'm trying to show you from this slide is that even though natural family planning isn't 100%, most things aren't. And then depending upon the behavior of the couple who's using a method, none of the methods approach 100% in typical use except the IUD, which of course requires no participation by the patient except for checking the presence of the string from time to time. So what does it take to have effective natural family planning? Accurate charting, which means, of course, to do that, you have to accurately observe the signs of fertility, the ones your method that you choose to use teaches, whether it's cervical mucus or temperature. Consistent use on a month to month. Mutual motivation by the partners. I found this in Lafayette to be a big problem, that many times maybe the woman feels highly motivated not to have a baby. Maybe the husband, who might be more interested in celebrating his marriage than the woman, doesn't have that same motivation. And so couples need to communicate regularly on whether they have a good reason to avoid a pregnancy and whether they should be avoiding or trying to achieve a pregnancy. And lastly is that loving cooperation between each spouse, that they can abstain when they're supposed to abstain to make this 98% effective. Now, if you live in Louisiana, which I guess most of you do, there's several methods that are commonly used. I'm not sure in Baton Rouge, but in Lafayette, the Billings ovulation method has made a marked inroad in the couples who use natural family planning. Many couples use this now, many teachers, as compared to 25 years ago when I got there, it was all couple-to-couple league, which was the temperature and mucus. So in perfect use, you can see the Billings method has a 99 to 100% effectiveness. Typically, by couples who don't follow the rules totally, it's an 89 to 99%. The Creighton model, which I think is probably more prevalent here and on the North Shore, maybe New Orleans, has standardized this observation of mucus and applied more the observations to be more useful for scientific observation and help with infertility. And again, with correct use, approaches 99.9%, with typical use 96.8%. So still very highly effective compared to the other forms or contraceptive forms. And lastly, of the three methods common in Louisiana, the symptothermal method or the STM or symptothermal method, typically the couple-to-couple league, but they've started to have in Lafayette more couples using the Marquette model and the Northwest model, which use temperature and mucus. And really, I think most of these methods, couples investigate, choose one, and do it, and if they're happy with it, stick with it. Some couples will try a method, not like it, or have an unintended pregnancy, will move to a different one, trying to achieve better regulation of births. But all of them work. It's not the method that's the problem. It's the patient's, or not patient in y'all's case, but the person's learning and discipline and application of the principles to make it as effective as a couple might like. Now, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the benefits of using natural family planning. And I think this is what makes this approach to the people who we're trying to convince to use it. It's more than just a way to regulate births. It's a way of life. It's accepting fertility as a natural gift from God, not something to be destroyed, but something to be managed. And it has many benefits that the church sees in its promotion of natural family planning. I've had 25 years of observation of couples who have struggled, couples who have grown in virtue, and I can tell you that it's that self-mastery, particularly for men, of their sexual drives, and finding ways to love women outside of the bedroom that leads to really strong marriages, which we have many of in Lafayette. Of course, to use natural family planning, I find requires one basic thing: faith that God really loves us, cares about our family size, and would never do anything to hurt us. And I believe that's probably the biggest challenge to couples who are considering it. Many don't have the faith and confidence in God to believe that they could use something that's not artificial and still not have their life be ruined or totally made, less desirable to them by God. Benefits include that there's no harmful side effects from natural family planning. It supports reproductive health by not destroying it or using chemicals to modify it. It's environmentally friendly in that you don't produce any waste byproducts from things like birth control pills. And it's virtually cost-free. Once you make the initial investment as an engaged or married couple to learn it, it costs almost nothing to use the natural family planning on a month-to-month basis. And it's highly adaptable. Couples who, once they recognize their signs of fertility, it helps couples both to achieve and to avoid a pregnancy. But I think the part that is the most important for couples, it requires that constant couple communication. Do we really have a good reason to avoid a pregnancy? Do we really have a good reason to abstain? How could we make our lives better by, in our behavior towards each other? Maybe you're helping me with the children so we could have another baby. Or maybe to the wife, if you spent a little less money, we could afford another baby. Those kind of conversations that most couples who use contraception never have, it's forced upon couples who use natural family planning to make these decisions. And it becomes a shared responsibility. Natural family planning should never be something where the husband looks at the wife and say, "You messed up. It's your fault we're pregnant." Couples should both learn the method, learn when to abstain, when not to, so that they can make these decisions together. So natural family planning respects God's design. This is from Humanae Vitae, number 13, which Father talked about. But to experience the gift of married love while respecting the laws of conception is to acknowledge that one is not the master of the sources of life, but rather the minister of the design established by the Creator. I think that marks the difference. At one time in my marriage, we used contraception before we knew any better, and this sentence sums us up totally, that we were the masters. We would decide when we'd have a baby. So spouses should never act to suppress or curtail the life-giving power given by God. That's an integral part of what they pledge to each other in their marriage vows, which is part of Married Love and a Gift of Life, written by John Paul II. I think our culture's lost sight of this slide, in that fertility is something sacred, that a couple can become co-creators with God, cooperating in bringing a new soul into existence that has an eternal life. I think we've totally lost view of that. I believe most couples in marriages see children as a boy maybe to play football, a girl to be a a ballet dancer, and they don't see clearly that they're doing something so powerful that affects eternity and cooperating with God's love. Lastly, natural family planning strengthens conjugal love and helps to establish families in peace and security. This was written by the Billings, who in Australia were the pioneers of the Billings method. They saw over years that natural family planning was a great tool to help build strong marriages. I'll skip this and just want to thank you again for the church for putting on such a great conference, and for those of you who came trying to learn more about it, hopefully to promote and help this world of ours see this truth a little more clearly. Thank you.
You know, that presentation allows us to understand how to collaborate with nature. It was really helpful to see the effectiveness of a correct use versus typical use by planning method. And certainly understanding the markers of peak fertility. And yes, the key ingredient of having faith and confidence in God. Thank you so much. You know, one of the appeals that Pope St. Paul VI made was to scientists. And he basically asked them to study the natural rhythms so that there would be a way to sufficiently secure for the chaste limitation of offspring. He also said that by their research, they could establish the truth of the Church's claim that there can be no contradiction between two divine laws, that which governs the transmitting of life and that which governs the fostering of married love. Our next presenter is one that is certainly well known in Baton Rouge and throughout Louisiana. Dr. Rob Chasik is here in Baton Rouge and a member of St. Agnes. He speaks nationally. He is a graduate of the University of California, San Diego Medical School, and he's accredited as a fertility care medical consultant by the American Academy of Fertility Care Professionals. In fact, he was recently recognized as Medical Consultant of the Year by that same association. Rob serves here as the Associate Director of the Family Medicine Residency Program at the Baton Rouge General Medical Center. He also serves as their Chief of Family Medicine for the hospital. So Rob is not only serving clients and patients, and certainly answers questions for all of us, for his friends and neighbors, but he's also involved in actually educating other doctors through the residency program. Rob credits his wife, Patty, for leading them to NFP. Please welcome Dr. Rob Chasik.
It's great to have this opportunity to talk to you about this topic. When many years ago, when my wife Patty led us into this idea of using natural family planning in our marriage, we were asked to become teachers. And in that process, you have to discern as a physician that you won't prescribe contraception anymore, and that was actually a big decision for me, believe it or not. But it was a decision I could make with great confidence because of the fact that even then the science was very good about the physiologic basis of the effectiveness of natural family planning. And we went on and started teaching, and in the course of that, women would bring me their charts of their fertility charts. And they'd bring with that some symptoms that they were having, and I'd listen to that, and I'd look at the charts, and I realized, here is potentially something that I should really be good at interpreting. There should be a way for me to systematically look at this. Just like I look at an EKG. If somebody puts an EKG in front of me, I know the intervals and the heights and the magnitude, and I know what's supposed to indicate a heart attack or not. Well, that's really what the fertility chart should be in taking care of women's health problems. And in fact, it is. And so I was very grateful when I was able to find a system that would allow me as a physician to have an insight into the underlying problems of women's health when they brought them to me, like infertility, et cetera, with use of their fertility charts, a Creighton model, fertility care system, and NAPER technology. So we're going to talk about that today. But I think even though we've had some very good reviews, just to call to mind as we're talking about these concepts, what is the reason why we're getting into this? So just, again, we're talking about Humanae Vitae today, and it states, we hold these physicians, these are the appeals of Pope Paul VI in Humanae Vitae, we hold these physicians and medical personnel in the highest esteem who, in the exercise of their profession, value above every human interest the superior demands of their Christian vocation. And that's one of the things we forget about in medicine often in our day-to-day life, kind of beat out of us a little bit, is that we're there as a calling. Just like people are called to be parents, they're called to be married, we're there as physicians as a calling. And if there's physicians in this group, I want you to think about that, or if they're health professionals, medical providers, nurses, PAs, nurse practitioners, think about why you're in this in the first place. I have been very grateful to use the Creighton model and NAPER technology as a way of uniting my faith with my work, as we're called to do. And let them also consider as their proper professional duty the task of acquiring all the knowledge needed in this delicate sector so as to be able to give to those married persons who consult them wise counsel and healthy direction, such as they have a right to expect. Well, they have a right to this. People have a right to this kind of medical care. So why is it important? Well, consider this. Consider parents who are seeking a physician for their daughter who will not undermine their efforts to promote chastity by kind of pushing and prescribing oral contraceptives. That's not actually an uncommon thing for women today. How about this? And if we have time, I'll finish this story, but this is a woman who presented to me, a 30-year-old woman. She was single with endometriosis, and if you've heard me talk, I've told this story a lot because it encompasses really what the difference is between this kind of a restorative approach to women's health and how it's typically done today in modern medicine. She's single, she wasn't married, she had endometriosis, a painful condition where there are abnormal implantations of the uterine lining actually inside the abdomen on the different organs. And she was told that she had no hope of ever having children at her age. She's 30 years old. She has another 15 to 20 years of fertility left. And she should just accept the fact that she will have to be on oral contraceptives indefinitely. Now, that's not really meeting her goals. Or this is a very common situation, and we'll be focusing on it today. Is there any way for a married couple to have effective medical care for infertility that's respectful of the sanctity of the life of the embryo and of the sacredness of the medical act we've been hearing about today? Is there something like that out there? If there is, then people of faith or people who just think that human beings, when they are start as an embryo, are human beings, they should have access to this kind of treatment. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to touch in just a little bit more detail on a particular fertility awareness-based method, or NFP method, called the Creighton Model Fertility Awareness System. And based on that, we're also going to talk about NAPRO technology, which is what uses that knowledge of a woman's cycle to treat different health problems. And so we'll focus, there's a lot of different health problems it treats, but we're going to focus on the common one that comes to me is infertility. And then in relation to that, once you have achieved pregnancy, we're going to talk about how to make that pregnancy last and avoid miscarriages and preterm pregnancy loss. So Dr. Hardy went through in detail very well the physiology. In fact, y'all had a whole course of reproductive physiology in about 3 slides there, okay? And in fact, we'll hand out little certificates afterwards because you have had as much or maybe more attention to that area than many of our medical students and residents, okay? And in fact, many of our nursing students, et cetera. Now, that's kind of a funny thing to state, but in a way it's true. So I'm going to go through this. Since you had such a big course, it didn't hurt to review a little bit this little flashcard, okay? And I don't know if you can see my arrow there. Can you see my arrow going around there a little bit? No, you can't. Okay. Never mind. Just look at the top line there, okay? The top line is what's happening to the ovary. In the ovary, you have a follicle. So at the very beginning of a woman's cycle, after she's finished menstruating, you recruit a follicle, and as it grows bigger and bigger, it has an egg in it, but the cells around it are making a lot of estrogen. And then you have in the middle ovulation. You can see that it ruptures, the follicle ruptures, and the egg's released. And then after that, those cells that are left behind form a corpus luteum, and they're making estrogen still, but then they start to make progesterone. That's across the top line of that chart. And then if you look down, you can see down three rows, there are the similar hormone levels as you go from left to right of estradiol that's being formed early in the cycle. Ovulation occurs, and then estrogen and progesterone. And then you see a couple of effects that you can monitor on a fertility chart. And the first one's at the top. It's called the body temperature, the basal body temperature. It goes up by 4/10 on average, 4/10 of a degree. And also you can see at the bottom the lining of the uterus, how it responds as a target organ for those hormones by increasing in thickness and its ability to accept a new child as it implants, okay? And then pregnancy, if a conception doesn't occur, if implantation doesn't occur, then at the end of that cycle, when the corpus luteum involutes, because it has about a 13-day cycle usually, or lifetime usually, it stops producing progesterone and estrogen, and a woman menstruates again. Well, you can monitor that on your fertility chart. But also what's forgotten is how important mucus is. Everybody knows about their menses or about the red flow, but very few women even are aware of the fact that they have a white flow or a mucus flow. And that's very important, and that's why these fertility awareness-based methods focus on the mucus many times, because for fertility, it enables the sperm to survive more than a few hours, okay, or minutes, okay? It assists the sperm in making its way up into the upper reproductive tract of the woman to meet the egg, and actually, it meets the egg up in the fallopian tube. You saw the anatomy earlier presented by Dr. Hardy. We're all conceived as new human beings in a fallopian tube, and we have a big journey to make over about 5 to 9 days before we make it down to the uterus to implant. But all that time, that embryo is sending messages back and forth to the woman's body, and things are getting ready in the uterus to accept that new baby. So that's a human being. And anything that gets in the way of that implanting is also something that's against nature. So the sperm then are assisted in their transport to meet the baby and to conceive a new human being in an embryo. And actually what's beautiful about this, we're going to show you a graphic here in a sec, the mucus sorts out abnormal sperm in a little bit, okay? So there's all sorts of different mucuses made that sort out. So God has created a plan where He is in charge of deciding who the next eternal reality is going to be in cooperation with that couple. He's the one who determines what child is conceived. So the main point is that mucus is absolutely essential for fertility. And this is something that's not really recognized by the medical community many times, or with in vitro fertilization, that kind of thing. And I can tell you as a medical educator, and I don't want to embarrass my residents, I got one of my residents here today, but it's not that infrequent that I have a resident come up to me and say, you know, this woman's been coming in every month. We cannot get rid of this discharge, no matter how many antibiotics I prescribe. You know, well, there's a little education that gets to take on there, but that's just to demonstrate that really, as a profession, we could do a lot more to educate each other. This is the graphic I'm talking about, and this was alluded to with Dr. Hardy's talk. If you look at that, that is the cervix that we're looking at. It joins the vagina to the uterus, and it's a gateway to the upper reproductive tract of a woman that the sperm have to get to form a new human being. And those little lines there, those little squares there, those are the little crypts, the cervical crypts that have the cervical mucus glands in them. Those little glands are the most important part of fertility if you understand fertility, okay? And so we gave you that little chart about estrogen being formed by the follicle before ovulation. Well, this Dr. Odeblad has mapped out the cervix, and he used micropipettes, sampling mucus from the different parts of the cervix. This is something that's just couple of centimeters long, but smallness, size doesn't determine function. And he's been able to map out where the different types of mucus happen. And so the mucus that allows sperm to survive and to be transported is in the upper part of that cervix, and it's also a flowing kind of mucus. And so you can see that under estrogen, there's a lot of mucus formed. It flows. You can see that in the little insert picture. And women can detect this as a sign of their fertility. So if you go through fertility awareness classes, you become an expert at the different types of mucus that are formed. Now, after ovulation, progesterone is formed, and it immediately dries up the mucus, so it doesn't flow anymore. There's mucus there, but it blocks, actually, any further sperm penetration, and it doesn't flow, so the woman has a sign of being dry, okay? So you can see that this is kind of like a biological valve. Around the time of ovulation is when the mucus is formed to enable a new human being to be made, to let that sperm get up into the upper reproductive tract for a conception, okay? And what that does, if you're trained to do that, then it ends up that you can map this out in your fertility charting, and it's very precise. So the Creighton model is a model that's taught one-on-one with a couple, with a woman, okay? So it's a very precise thing, and if I'm going to use something to diagnose and treat medical problems, I want it to be very precise. So we have a very precise chart, and if you look, this is a typical chart, and I think Dr. Hardy showed you a couple of these. First you have the red stamps for bleeding, and then you have some green stamps for the dry period before fertility, and then you have the white stamps that show that the mucus is being formed, and then the mucus ends and dries up, and the end of that fertile type of mucus, that's called the peak day, and the peak day is a very accurate sign of ovulation having occurred inside the woman. Now, if you had an ultrasound machine and you could do it on yourself at home every day, then that would be an even better way of knowing if you've ovulated, okay? Most women don't have that. I don't have one, okay? And, but this is a very good method, okay? And the main point that we gave you all that physiology for is that what's happening on this chart is a direct day-to-day reflection of what's happening with the hormones and with ovulation within the woman. This is a very strongly based on physiology method, very strong day-to-day reflection. So it doesn't matter whether you're regular or irregular, day-to-day you're making observations that tell you whether you're fertile or you're infertile, okay? So this is very precise. And it's a beautiful window into what's happening in women's health. And that's what I'm going to try and demonstrate to you a little bit here. Now, I've already mentioned that this is individualized teaching. It's taught by a certified professional to teach this, and it's easily learned. You have an introductory session, and you have about 5 sessions with them in the first several months of learning how to do this, and women pick up on it quite readily, okay? So now I'm going to talk about how is this applied then to medical practice? Because all of these methods are very good at avoiding pregnancy, as Dr. Hardy demonstrated, okay? Now I'm going to talk about, you have great information. This is beautiful. This is like having an EKG into women's health, okay? Because I can look at these charts in a systematic way and know what's going on in their body. So natural procreative technology, NAPR technology, what it does, it unites that fertility awareness with medical diagnosis and treatment, and it's a restorative approach, okay? In other words, we're looking to see what's wrong with a woman. We have an idea of what her cycle's doing, and then we restore it to its fertile health, okay? We don't just take a pill and suppress it, okay? We don't put a Band-Aid on unusual bleeding and that kind of thing. We actually try and work with the body at the right time, giving the right kinds of hormones to affect a fertile state, okay? And then, really importantly, we approach women as whole persons, okay? Women come for a variety of different reasons to the doctor. They have their own response to illness, and they have their own goals. Some women are trying to achieve pregnancy. Some people are trying to avoid pregnancy. But if you're trying to achieve pregnancy, we shouldn't just offer you things that only help you avoid pregnancy, okay? So they treat you as a whole person. So NAPR technology is based on this system. It was developed by Dr. Hilgers. He's now in Omaha, and his wife Susan and a couple of other founders. And a reason I'm mentioning this is their response to the appeals to science and medicine from Humanae Vitae. This is a very directly, Dr. Hilgers was a medical student, maybe an early resident when Humanae Vitae came out. Nobody else was really looking at this in a medical way. And so we're really in great debt to he and his co-founders for establishing this system. So this is a system, and we're not going to be able to talk about all of these things. We're going to focus on infertility, but it's also used to maintain pregnancy and to avoid late pregnancy loss, to correct really irregular cycles. One of the common things people come to me is about premenstrual syndrome, when people take on a whole new personality about a week before their cycle comes on, with irritability and bloatedness and just not being able to stand people around them, right? This is a real thing that's often not accepted by physicians as well, but something that with this kind of a system is very readily treated. Recurrent ovarian cysts, especially early in a woman's reproductive life, are a very common reason for a woman to have surgery. And in fact, as a part of that, often young women lose an ovary due to this, okay? But if you chart your cycles and you treat and restore the cycle to normal, many times you can prevent these, and you prevent the loss of an ovary. Unusual bleeding, of course, is able to be treated. We treat postpartum depression very effectively with progesterone and treat hormonal imbalances. And I think it's a more effective way of treating polycystic ovarian syndrome as well. So really, in my practice, I've been doing this for many years, there's really very few times when I would say I'd have to rely on sort of fake hormones and a birth control pill to treat any woman's health problem, okay? So this is very effective. So let's revisit again this chart, okay? This is what people bring in to me when they have their problems and how I help diagnose them. There's a systematic way to look at this. I can look at the overall length of the cycle to see what reproductive category women are in, get an idea if they have PCOS or something else. I can look at their bleeding pattern to see if it's related to an ovulation or not and make a more accurate diagnosis of that. I can see what their pre-ovulation period before the peak day is, how long that is, how variable that is, and get an idea of what's going on there. I can look at it, the post-peak, the post-ovulation period, and get an idea of whether they're at risk for miscarriage and that kind of thing, whether the hormones are going to be off. And then I can apply medical diagnostic tests to sort that out. So if you look at it systematically, you can get a very good idea initially what's going on with a woman. And this slide again, just to reiterate again so that you realize, is a direct reflection of the changes in the hormone levels. This is the estrogen goes up. You can see the blue line, the estrogen going up through the cycle. That's when the white mucus stamps are there. And then you ovulate, and almost immediately that progesterone dries up the mucus, and you have a post-peak period until the next period ensues. So looking at each of these things and the way they reflect a woman's biological health, I can then use that chart as the initial impression. So this, again, then just will give you a little bit of a clue, okay? Look at this chart at the top. I've labeled this as a chart of being predictive of a woman who might have infertility. And you just look at it for a second and compare it back with what this chart looks like, with the dryness, and then this mucus, and then the dry period afterward. And I've told you that you need mucus to be fertile, right? It's essential. Well, in that top chart, there's only 1 day of mucus. So if a woman brings this in and she has 1 day of mucus, or I look at the type of mucus that she's been taught how to identify and know that it's a very limited mucus cycle, then I've got an idea that I've got to start working with her and helping her produce better mucus, okay? Look at that middle chart, okay? What's different about that chart? Well, if I look at the beginning, the bleeding is normal. The overall length is a little short, but not that short. There's a dry period before her mucus, and then there's a mucus patch. That seems pretty good in length anyway. But what is different about it? Well, what's different is the time after ovulation is very short, okay? That's a very short post-ovulatory or post-peak period. Now, that's associated with miscarriage. I've labeled that as associated with miscarriage because, as I told you, we're all conceived up in the fallopian tube, and we've got to make a journey for about 5 to 9 days. And if you have a very short post-peak period, you're about ready to have your menses just as the child is making its way down to the uterus to implant, okay? And in fact, if implantation does occur in a woman who has cycles like this, there are very low progesterone levels usually, which are difficult to maintain a pregnancy with, okay? So I can predict that she'll have trouble with miscarriage, and we'll direct our diagnostic and therapeutic interventions to prevent that. And by the way, we don't really have to wait, as is often done in modern medicine. We wait till a woman's had 2 or 3 miscarriages, right, before we think it's abnormal. Well, if you have a powerful window into a woman's physiology, and you know before she even has her first pregnancy that there's a problem, you can intervene before that miscarriage happens, and I'll show you a study later on that shows how effective that is. If you haven't had enough, let's look at that last chart, okay? Have you had enough? I don't care. We're going to look at it anyway, okay? It's up on the slide. I made the slide, okay? So if you look at that, you see that the length of the chart of the cycle is about normal. If you look at the bleeding, there's something funny about that bleeding. I've made a sort of a graphic representation of a woman who has sort of the spotting, which is brown or black bleeding at the end of her cycle. That's not a normal thing. People come into me that are having infertility problems, and they have this bleeding, and they don't know that it's abnormal. They've had it all their life, right? But this is abnormal, and it usually means that the previous cycle's progesterone levels were low, okay? There's other things that it can mean too, but that's just one of the things. And then you can see at the end of the cycle, there's some red stamps also that means that they've been spotting, and that's spotting that's in the wrong part of the cycle. And if you didn't have this chart, you wouldn't know if it was a menses or something else, right? But the power of this chart shows me that it's premenstrual spotting, and that also is a particular sign of somebody with a low progesterone. So you can see that this chart gives you an idea, with abnormal bleeding, where is it at, okay? Is it all the same thing? Because really, without this, you just say, well, it's dysfunctional bleeding, and you just treat it generically, okay? So I hope that gives you an insight. And that's just a little insight, sort of a high-altitude insight, that the chart, being a direct reflection of a woman's physiology, is a very useful tool for helping to diagnose and treat women. So let's go on a little bit. One of the main things we do in NAPR technology is look at a woman's hormones, okay? So if I know a woman's looking at her cycle, then she can get those hormones done at the right time. If somebody's having infertility, we'll do those little green arrows there. Maybe you can see this in the back bracket. Those green arrows are times when I'll get a peri-ovulatory or a peri-peak day estrogen level to see how her follicle is functioning. Now, some larger centers, like the Pope Paul VI Institute in Omaha, they have an ultrasonographer on call that can look at the ovary every day and track its size and its function. Well, I don't have that here. But I can look at the estrogen levels to get an idea whether that's normal or not and decide whether I'll intervene with ovulation-inducing drugs early in the treatment plan or not. And then after a woman's ovulated, I get several progesterone and estrogen levels to see what their hormones are doing afterwards, see how the corpus luteum is functioning. And so there's a couple of things here. I'm getting ovulatory and post-ovulatory hormone levels, and I'm getting more than one level. Let's look and see why that is, okay? Dr. Hardy alluded to it earlier. In a single woman, from cycle to cycle, she's not going to ovulate on the same day of her cycle as a previous one often. And women who have women's health problems particularly have a very variable pre-ovulatory period, whether it's due to stress, illness, travel, or just the underlying problem that they have with ovulation. And so if you don't know when a woman's ovulating, you don't know when to check her estrogen levels. So that helps me check that. And then if you don't know when she's ovulated, then you can't know when to get the progesterone level, because the progesterone is only made after ovulation, okay? So you have to have a system like this that tells you when somebody's ovulating so you can get the hormones at the right time. Typical practice is for a doctor to say, I want to look at your hormones, go get a estrogen and progesterone level done on day 21 of your cycle, because they assume that every woman has a 28-day cycle, which is not true. Even healthy women, only about 13% of them have a 28-day cycle. And then, that day 21 is supposed to be right in the middle of their post-ovulatory phase for a 28-day cycle. Well, women who are having problems don't have 28-day cycles. If you look at this chart, I put an X where the woman got her blood drawn on day 21, okay? Looking to see if the progesterone's abnormal. Well, it's going to be low, but it's going to be low because the woman has not ovulated yet, not because she's having any problem with her hormones, She's not supposed to have progesterone at that time. This woman has a delayed ovulation, very common for people presenting with women's health problems. So you get an idea that you have to know when a woman's ovulating to get accurate hormone levels. And then not only that, you have to do more than one level. At least once you have to do more than one level, because there are different ways for a woman's hormones to be abnormal, okay? This is looks like a bowl of spaghetti, so I'm sorry about that. But if you look, the red curve is the normal representation of a red peaking progesterone level, okay? And if you look at the purple curve, you can see that it starts off above the red curve at the beginning of her post-ovulatory phase, but very quickly it goes to abnormal. And if you look at the yellow curve, you can see that it stays at or above the normal hormone level for progesterone halfway through her post-ovulatory phase, but then drops off dramatically prior to the time that it should, okay? So these are all actually pretty well-defined different types of luteal abnormality, luteal hormone abnormalities, okay? And so if you don't at least once get several blood draws in that luteal phase, you might just get a normal level and think that it's normal, and you won't have all the information you could have in diagnosing the problem correctly. So that's just a little high altitude about how we diagnose people using the charting, how we target our diagnostic tests to the right time of the cycle. In a very similar way then, once we've found a problem, we can use the charting to help restore their cycle by giving the hormones, if they have a hormonal abnormality, by giving that at the right time of the cycle. That's called cooperative progesterone replacement therapy or cooperative estrogen replacement therapy. The idea is it cooperates and it's restorative, okay? And of course, same concept, progesterone's made after ovulation, and the pre-ovulatory phase is variable, so you have to know when the peak day is so you can give your progesterone after the peak day in a normal restorative fashion. Okay, so that's given you kind of an idea of how one of the major interventions we make in the hormones. We also make interventions in the mucus, and there's several other interventions, but that gives you a good idea of the power in a woman's cycle to help diagnose and treat medical illness, okay? So let's focus then on what our approach is for one of the more common things that comes to me would be infertility, okay? Infertility is a big problem. In fact, if you look at the literature, there are varying estimates, but around 15 to 30% of couples have trouble conceiving and bringing a baby to term. That's a big problem, okay? And the usual treatment for this these days has become seeking help with in vitro fertilization, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We've tried to remain very positive about our calling from Humanae Vitae. I do want to contrast it, though, with what in vitro fertilization is, because even medical students, most lay people, they don't know really what are the steps for in vitro fertilization, or even why is it that the church does not embrace in vitro fertilization. In fact, considers it something that is not licit for you to use to achieve fertility, okay? So a lot of people don't know that. I'm going to go through it a little bit, okay? Let's look back at one of the other encyclicals that came out about 20 years after Humanae Vitae. This is Donum Vitae, the gift of life, and it has a couple of main concepts: respect for the embryo and respect for marital life. Does that sound familiar? It sounds familiar, just like Humanae Vitae. Well, it was published by put forth by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which at that time was headed by Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict. So, Donum Vitae, respect for the embryo, just briefly. From the moment of conception, the life of every human being is to be respected in an absolute way, because man is the only creature on earth that God has wished for himself. And the spiritual soul of each man is immediately created by God. His whole being bears the image of the Creator. This is the dignity of the human person. God alone is the Lord of life from its beginning until its end. No one can, in any circumstance, claim for himself the right directly to destroy an innocent human being, and in fact, by extrapolation, or to create for themselves a human being. So that's the respect for the dignity of the embryo, but also respect for marriage in Donum Vitae. Human procreation requires on the part of the spouses responsible collaboration with the fruitful love of God. The gift of human life, the gift of human life, not the right of human life, but the gift of human life, it must be actualized in marriage through the specific and exclusive acts of husband and wife in accordance with the laws inscribed in their persons and in their union. That means each marital act would be open to love, and that humans are created through that specific sacramental act. And that child has the right to be conceived and carried in the womb and brought into the world and brought up within marriage. So this is the two major concepts that you have to think about when you're evaluating what does illicit means for achieving pregnancy and treating infertility, okay? So I think we should look at what is assisted reproductive or IVF, so that you're aware of that and you can see how it's different the way we treat it with NAPR technology. First of all, one of the techniques that's used is intrauterine insemination. Whether you induce ovulation in a woman or just she has a natural cycle, sperm is collected usually through masturbation, which is, again, not an illicit process, and then injected into the uterus in hopes of conceiving and carrying a baby. That's often not very effective. Then with in vitro, there are several steps that occur. The first one is to sort of take control of the ovaries and then to stimulate them, and you kind of super stimulate them, and then you harvest the eggs with a needle, okay? And they usually harvest several eggs, okay? And you have to sort of overstimulate the ovary, and about 1% to 2% of the time, that can lead to a very dangerous situation of hyperstimulation of the ovary, which can be life-threatening from internal bleeding. And then you collect sperm and prepare it. So you're sort of choosing sperm, and it's also gone through masturbation. And then you take the eggs that you've harvested and the sperm, and you create embryos in a Petri dish. And if you're not going to use all of them, you freeze them. And of course, that's not respectful of the embryo because, number one, they haven't been conceived in an act of love in the womb, and they die when they're frozen. And then when you unfreeze them, a portion of them die as well. And there's no licit means in the church that the church has come out and said is licit for saving these embryos. So that's still a moral question that hangs out there. And then you try and transfer those human beings into the uterus so that they'll implant and grow and be born, okay? So you can see that in relation to donum vitae, you're taking the creation of a human being, making it kind of a right. We have a right to a child. It's not a gift anymore. We're taking under our dominion to pick who's going to be a child and who's not by how we look at the embryos and which ones we throw away, which one we freeze, and it's not respecting marriage. So, and it's not respecting marriage in this sense that, you can have many people involved in vitro fertilization. You can have people that want to have the child, but they can hire people to donate sperm or eggs or embryos, or they can be asked. They can try and hire somebody to be a surrogate, okay, and carry that baby for them. So you can have so many people. That's not respecting the exclusivity of marriage. So I just wanted to throw that out there so you see that's what's being offered today to women, and we'll see. We're going to compare how effective that is. It's not effective, not very effective, and compare how effective it is to what we do with NAPR technology. And NAPR technology, I just want to reassure you, does respect the marital act. Everything we do with NAPR technology respects the woman and facilitates the marital act. We're trying to focus on, we treat male infertility as well, but we focus on the women and optimize her fertility so that the marital act is more effective in creating a new human being. And then we respect that new human being, the embryo, from its very beginnings, its right to have be conceived in the womb and be a product of the love of the couple. Okay. So I'm a family physician, so I have a family physician approach with this, right? Of course, with any time you go to the doctor, you expect them to get a history, get a thorough history, and do a physical exam. And then I ask them to do the Creighton model charting for about 2 cycles. And it takes about 2 cycles for women to become confident of when they're ovulating, confident of their peak day. So it takes 2 cycles, and then they come back to me, and when they're confident, I can look at their charts, get an idea of where the problems lie, and usually we'll get a hormone profile by the 3rd cycle. We also have the male get a seminal fluid analysis, but we recommend they do that in a morally licit manner. I won't go into detail here, but that's something that is possible to be done. It's not masturbation. And then if an ultrasound series is available, we get that. I usually get an ultrasound anyway for anatomy, but if we have an ultrasound series, you can get that. That's done commonly at some of the larger centers. And then once we've made a diagnosis, and usually we find several things that are wrong to treat, because there's an underlying problem to fertility that affects the mucus, that affects the bleeding, that affects everything, okay? And so we can usually find something wrong, and many times more than one thing. And then we restore or correct all of those problems. And if you bring a woman to a healthy state, what is a healthy state? A healthy state is a fertile state, okay? And then as a family doctor, I'll go along with a couple for about 6 to 12 cycles that have optimal hormones, because we check one hormone level in the middle of their post-ovulatory phase for every cycle we're trying to achieve. So normal hormones, normal mucus, and normal fertility-focused relations, okay? And if they are having trouble conceiving in the first few cycles, I'll send them to a surgeon who's focused on fertility and cherishes fertility themselves. And of course, all throughout this period, I'm working with somebody and a couple that's been called to be parents. So we also include success as talking about adoption along this way too. Now, I do make surgical referrals. Often women have endometriosis, whether they have painful cycles or not. And so if we're not having success, I'll send it to a surgeon who cares about fertility and cares about avoiding the problems with surgery that can happen when you do procedures like adhesions or scarring that can form over ovaries or tubes. So there are surgeons that use these techniques. We've got a couple of them. Dr. Hardy and Dr. Cuddy, his partner in Lafayette, are two of those people that are available nearby. This slide, if you look at this just gives you an idea that we do a thorough evaluation. This is from about 1,000 couples that were from a systematic case series of a practice, NAPRO practice in Ireland. And these are people who had an evaluation before they came to the NAPRO doctor, and then what their evaluation was afterward. And you can see that on that first line, that about half the people that came had a workup but still didn't have any idea of what was causing their infertility. And after NAPRO evaluation, 0.5% had not had something identified. And then if you think about miscarriage, about 12% had not had anything identified about why they were having miscarriages, and with NAPRO technology, that was only 0.2%. Now, actually, in reality, for most places, that unexplained miscarriage is about half. So that's actually a favorable population. And then if you look at some of the diagnoses that were made in that NAPRO practice, limited cervical mucus is something that we can look at, that really, if you don't have charting, you can't make that diagnosis, and so you can't use any means and interventions to improve it. But it's essential for fertility. So just by paying attention to a woman's chart, we already have a very powerful means of treating her infertility. And secondly, you can see that suboptimal progesterone and suboptimal estradiol levels are also very commonly diagnosed and treated. So what's the effectiveness? Oh, well, in NAPRO technology, I just said that there are it gives women and couples an idea of when they're fertile. Some people who are having trouble getting pregnant, all they need to know is when they're fertile. Here's a study that came from Europe about the natural conception rates of subfertile couples that were trying to achieve. It was a prospective case series that looked at 187 women aged 21 to 47. It's done in Germany. And their average time for trying to achieve pregnancy was 3.5 years. That's a tough crowd to treat in general. Okay, and they were observed for using these this fertility awareness method called the Sensiplan for 8 months. And after training, 40% of them were able to conceive. Now that's a pretty high rate. It's usually about 30%, 20 to 30% for other methods. But untrained couples were the comparison group, so it really almost doubled the rate of conception in this group. Just learning the method. Okay. And if you look at that, the untrained couples, they were infertile as well, but they achieved. And so any method that you look at, their effectiveness, you have to account for. There are going to be people who conceive over a year or two, even if they've been labeled as infertile. So any effectiveness has to be beyond that level. All right, so what's the effectiveness of NAPR technology for infertility? Well, there are two big practices that have been observed systematically as a cohort. And in this first practice in Ireland, there were 1,200 couples. 33% of them, about a third of them, had had in vitro fertilization treatments already, and their average age was almost 36 years old. This is a very tough group to treat usually. The mean time that they've been trying to get pregnant in this sample of patients was almost 6 years. You know, if you go beyond a year trying to get pregnant, that your probabilities drop off pretty quickly. Yet they had a fantastic effectiveness rate. 53% per 100 couples were able to achieve within 2 years. That's above a baseline pregnancy rate of 10%. Okay, I'm going to move along here for the next study. It was a Canadian study. This was a smaller number of couples, but a very good study. Again, a third of them had had in vitro fertilization already, and this study achieved a 66% effectiveness rate. This is really very good for infertility, okay? And that's compared to a spontaneous conception rate in the Canadian population at that time of about 20% at 2 years. So illicit means to treat infertility that's very effective. It's very effective in comparison with IVF. Now, this is the latest data available from the CDC on their website about the effectiveness of in vitro fertilization. It's a little busy, but let's concentrate on the less than 35-year-old column. That's the middle column. This is looking at 39,000 reported cycles. It's a big database where in vitro centers report their success rates. The percent of cycles that ended up with a live birth were 33% in the best, in the most effective treated group. So I think that NAPR technology actually compares very favorably with in vitro fertilization. In the interest of time, I'm going to go on and talk about the evidence. Now, the evidence I gave you for NAPR technology is observations of a cohort of patients. You know, that's not a randomized trial, but it's a very strong physiologic model, and it's a very good systematic review of practices. So it's very good evidence, and most medicine actually doesn't have even that good of evidence, okay? As you can imagine, in vitro fertilization has a lot of money behind it. They do have, at last review of the Cochrane database of systematic reviews, the premier kind of database for evidence that's done in this way. They were only able to find 20 randomized trials for in vitro fertilization. And this is for subfertile couples that have unexplained infertility. And all these trials compared in vitro fertilization to just waiting and seeing, expected management, or to various combinations of intrauterine insemination, whether you induce the ovaries or not. And they did look at a live birth rate per woman, which in the past they've just looked at per cycle, which was a highly exaggerated rate. So their conclusions of these authors were that IVF may be more effective than just waiting to see what happened, and it may be more effective than intrauterine insemination with or without drugs to induce ovulation, but there is insufficient evidence to draw firm conclusions, okay? So they have a lot of randomized trials, but still even with that, they can't draw a firm conclusion about whether IVF works. And this is something that people pay $20,000 a cycle for, usually not covered by insurance, and of course has a lot of side effects associated with it, with the hyperstimulation. And if you're not successful, which you're only successful in the best group about 33% of the time, you're done with their evaluation, you still have the problem that you came in with because no effort has been made to find out what the problem was, okay? I did want to talk real quick about the use of progesterone in pregnancy. There's been controversy about it. It's used to prevent miscarriages many times. Loss before 20 weeks, that's miscarriage. And it's not widely accepted many times to do this. It's been used to prevent preterm delivery, and actually that's more accepted, especially when people have short cervixes, short cervical length, or a history of preterm loss. But that's for people who have later losses and later in pregnancy. So it has been controversial, but actually what we do in NAPR technology has been corroborated recently last year by a randomized trial coming out of Egypt. And these are all the risk factors of miscarriage. There's a lot of risk factors, but still about half of women don't have a lot of these risk factors and have miscarriages repeatedly, and we can't find out why. But this, what we do in NAPR technology of identifying hormonal abnormalities in their cycle and treating them has been a mainstay of what we do. So now this Egyptian trial that came out of Aswat, Egypt, is a very good randomized controlled trial. I reviewed this for our group at our national meeting just this last year. They had 700 women that they looked at with recurrent miscarriages, aged 20 to 39, and they gave them progesterone twice daily in the post-ovulation, after ovulation phase, just what we do in NAPR technology, okay? And their miscarriage rate dropped from 23% to 12%. So they dropped the miscarriage rate by half, okay? They increased the live birth rate, and they decreased the premature delivery rate, okay? So I think that what we're doing here has been and continues to be corroborated by medical science. Now, I was going to talk more about the use of progesterone in pregnancy. That's a little bit more controversial. I'm not going to cover it now in the interest of time because I've over-talked, and I see a lot of ears rolling down the aisle right now, so if you collect your ears up afterwards, we'd appreciate it. But I do want to talk just a little bit about the case that we had before, okay? And we do, by the way, we do have brochures that Dr. Danielle Van Hoff from the diocese has brought for us about where you can get information about natural family planning and about doctors who do NAPR technology. And Daniel, thank you for doing that and for advertising our meeting today. Let me just say, you know, and especially if there's any aspiring or current medical professionals in the building, you know, that 30-year-old woman that came to me when I was just getting involved in this really had an effect on me. She had endometriosis. She was kind of crazy because she was being treated with Lupron and put into chemical menopause. And she said, isn't there anything I can do? You know, I got to do something. And I said, what did your doctor tell you could do to get pregnant? He said, you know, well, you know, or to treat your endometriosis. He said, well, you know, you're just going to have to be on birth control pills indefinitely. He said, well, what if I want to get pregnant? And what he said to her is, honey, you're not married. You're 30. You're done. Okay? And just like that, okay? This is a woman who has 15 more years of reproductive life available to her, okay? So I lost track of that patient. Actually, after I had sent her up to Pope Paul VI Institute, I sent her up there, and they did a major surgery on her and all that kind of thing. But I'd lost track of her, and then I was doing a coffee to recruit people to treat this method, and one of her friends said, hey, I know about so-and-so, and you know what? She's married, and she's going to deliver in about 3 months. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I was walking out of Easter service in that vestibule of that church. A woman comes up to me, I didn't recognize, had changed her hair. It's this lady. She's got her second child, okay? So that's the difference of respecting women as persons, of deserving of a diagnosis, of answering a call to medicine. So if you're an aspiring person, this is why you do this. This is why you unite your faith life with your professional life. It's not religious medicine. This is good medicine. It just happens that the truth in medicine is the truth in religion. The truth is a person, and that's Jesus Christ. And if you do things as He wants you to do them, things will work out well. So thank you very much for your attention.
You know, a few things: the importance of fertility awareness and the importance of charting. The observations of physiological signs, really, really important. It was really interesting how fertility care professionals collaborate with nature rather than going against nature. You know, and there is effective medical care for those suffering from infertility. And things, for example, as mucus is absolutely essential for fertilization. So there's certainly a lot of learning, and we need to learn. We need to understand this. You know, in addition, Pope Paul VI also had an appeal to those in public authority. He said that all should be committed to the responsibility of safeguarding the common good. He says, never allow the morals of your peoples to be undermined. The family is the primary unit in the state. Do not tolerate any legislation which would introduce into the family those practices which are oppressed to the natural law of God. There's someone here in Louisiana that is actually a leader, not only in Louisiana, but nationwide. Anytime there's an issue of legislation that is against life, she's given a call. Our next presenter, Dorinda Bordley, is Vice President and Senior Counsel for the Bioethics Defense Fund. The Bioethics Defense Fund is a public interest organization that basically argues for life in any court and benefits lawmakers, courts, and students and citizens across the United States on helping to draft legislation that is effective and is able to be passed. And so for those that are trying to respond to the appeal of Pope Paul, Dorinda's cell phone is the one they call. She received a BA in Finance and a JD from Loyola University. She and her husband, Tony, live in New Orleans. Please welcome Dorinda Bordley.
Thank you, Father, for inviting me today. Thank you all for coming on this Saturday. I want to thank you all for being here, and also my 4 children who have introduced me to this beautiful law of the gift. So I'm not a doctor. I don't even play one on TV. But I'm here to give you the legal perspective of how we can incorporate our beautiful faith into law and medicine. And so to tell you a little bit about what I do, because people don't understand what lawyers do anyway, much less public interest lawyers. So Bioethics Defense Fund is a nonprofit legal organization, and we operate at this intersection right in the middle between law, science, and ethics. We do that addressing issues that address the public, but not a particular person. So the unborn child and the woman who is often harmed by abortion. We address bioethics issues, biotechnology, human cloning, embryonic stem cell research, euthanasia, end-of-life issues, making moral decisions at the end of life. And then with physicians, we often represent the Catholic Medical Association or other medical groups who are experiencing healthcare rights of conscience violations, where you have hospitals or governments trying to force doctors to violate their conscience. How do we do that? Well, we draft model legislation for Louisiana here, which is one of the most pro-life states in the country, and states around the nation and the world. We help to defend those in court by writing amicus briefs and by consulting with state attorneys general, and by educating, mainly in law schools and medical schools, but also at conferences like this one. So, who is it that decides the human life issues of our day? Well, for the abortion issue, that's the anomaly, because the U.S. Supreme Court has taken over in 1973 as a super legislature, okay? That's why Roe will be reversed at some point, because it's just a fiction in our federalist and democratic process that five people would control this issue for a nation of 300 million, right? So it's like the Supreme Court is the abortion control board. Every time a law is passed by the will of the people, it makes sense legally, it makes sense medically, it's good for the health of the woman, it protects the child. The abortion industry runs off to the federal courts and asks them to undo the will of the people, okay? But the other issues, the biotech issues and the end-of-life issues, these are in the democratic process. So that's why you'll often see states. There's a handful of states that have legalized physician-assisted suicide, right, at the ballot. These are things that the U.S. Supreme Court has said, no, we're not going to do a Roe v. Wade of physician-assisted suicide. This remains in the democratic process. So again, what does reversing Roe mean? Before we get into the law of the gift, I just wanted to make this clear. Reversing Roe doesn't mean that abortion is outlawed. It simply means that we would have 5 votes, 5 justices, to send it back to the states, where it would be debated in the democratic process, okay? So we have currently at most 4 votes that we think might be leaning towards establishing our federalist system of government. We need 5. We may or may not have 5. We have to have our cases continue to go up, and we'll be finding out. But again, the court will not be deciding this issue. It will be decided in the states. And so the things that I'm going to be discussing with you today are ways that we can incorporate faith and reason to make a reasoned argument on why we should choose life in the democratic process. So, how do we decide? Well, right now, there's two schools of thought on how we decide these human life issues. The court has embraced this law of radical autonomy, and it says that woman cannot find herself or fulfill herself unless she can assert herself, even against her own unborn child. It pits the woman against her own child. And then this line of reasoning says that men can use women as objects and then abandon them to abortion. That's what they call autonomy. It's the law of the jungle. It's the strong against the weak. But the law of the gift is this, that human beings are fulfilled by mutual self-giving, not self-assertion. Where does that law of the gift come from? Well, of course, it's integral to the gospel, but it was incorporated in the Church's constitution called, in Vatican II, called Gaudium et Spes. And John Paul II spent his pontificate talking about this gift of self. And there it says, a human being cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. So just think about it. You're home, you're miserable, you're ruminating, your kids don't listen to you, woe is me, right? The phone rings, someone needs you, your girlfriend. You run out there, you're there for her, you do the errands she needs, whatever, you're there on the spot. You're forgetting yourself and making a gift of yourself to someone else. All of a sudden, you're back on. You feel great, right? That's when we're at our best, when we're in communion and in relationship with one another. So it's not just about women. JP2 said in his letter to women that a human being, whether male or female, is a unique and unrepeatable creature who cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of self. So, again, we have this law of radical autonomy versus law of the gift. Look at how similar these look. It's like a self-assertion. I'm going out, but I'm asserting myself. It's me against the world. Versus a self-giving, a pouring out of self, a forgetting of self. Okay? This is the beauty of something that we can discover through our reason. So before we get into all these different biotech issues and how we address them, we have things from surrogate pregnancy to disability abortions, where children are targeted with disabilities for abortion, where the government is forcing the little sisters of the poor to pay for contraceptive drugs and abortifacient drugs. Before we can discuss those things, there's a few preliminary questions. The first one is, does this practice respect the human person? The second one is the Supreme Court always right? And the second is, when does human life begin? I'm going to quickly touch on those. So here's an easy way. When you see all of these weird science things coming up in the news, 3-parent embryos, human cloning, embryonic stem cell research using frozen embryos left over from IVF. How do we look at this as people of faith, people of goodwill? And an easy way that I've found is to ask this question: does the practice treat that human being as a person who was created to love and be loved, or does it treat this human being as an object to use and be used, right? Now, you've just heard this beautiful gift of natural fertility methods where the spouses can make a gift of themselves in their marriage, really showing how it's a love and be loved situation. They have to communicate. They have to be there for one another. Whereas when the contraceptive mentality takes over, it's easy for the woman to be objectified, to be used as a commodity, to be used as a thing of pleasure without the repercussions to her health and her mental well-being and emotional well-being. So that's kind of an overview. So let's look at how that second question, does the Supreme Court always get it right? And I'm going to use this example of slavery. When we're saying person or object, and is the Supreme Court always right, I want to show you quickly how the court framed the issue in the case called Dred Scott versus Sanford. This is a picture of Dred Scott. His so-called master, he was in the South, had taken him to the North. And he said, hey, I'm in the free states now. I'm going to sue for my freedom. Well, it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is how the court itself framed the issue. They said the question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported, look at this language of commodity, a thing to use, whose ancestors were imported into this country, sold as slaves, become a member of the political community? Here's their holding. This is in the words of the court. No, they had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Again, look at this language of commodification. The slave was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and trafficked wherever a profit could be made. This is the U.S. Supreme Court. Do you think they had this right? They have Roe versus Wade just as right as they had this. And they're not talking about unborn human beings, they're talking about human beings walking around. So you can see how the court has a checkered history, right? And they can be wrong. Here's the dissent. The dissenting opinion is the decision by a judge who doesn't agree with the majority. Justice McClain said, a slave is not a mere chattel. He bears the impress of his maker and is amenable to the laws of God and man, and he is destined to an endless existence. So here's the dissenting opinion saying, this is a human being, this is a man who has a soul, right? That's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the dignity of the human person. And so when we go from talking about the slave trade, that brings us into all kinds of other biotech issues, but it's more difficult for people to visualize because at that embryonic stage of development, people will say, well, it doesn't look like a human being. Well, the answer is this is exactly what a human being looks like at day one. This is what a human being looks like. And so based on, this is a white paper you can get from our website, based on universally accepted criteria. There's no debate here. Every human being comes into existence at the moment of sperm-egg fusion. This is by our science advisor, Dr. Maureen Kondik. And she compiled, and I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes, but you can get this from our website. This is one of the most famous medical textbooks used. And when politics are out of it, you'll see that doctors agree when life begins. Human development begins at fertilization, when the sperm fuses with the oocyte, egg, to form a single cell, the zygote. This highly specialized cell marks the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. Another famous embryology textbook, Larson, says all of us were once human embryos. So the study of human embryology is the study of our own prenatal origins and experiences. So the myth about, oh, it's just a blob of fetal tissue is just that. It's just word spin. The scientists know when life begins. And if you download this paper, you'll also see a list of 34 little quotes from peer-reviewed medical journals saying things like human life begins with sperm-egg fusion. The last one, the fusion of a sperm with an egg to form a new life is a highly regulated event. So again, this is uncontroverted evidence. We're dealing with a human life from that moment of sperm-egg fusion. And this is the website if you wanted to download these 7 pages of quotes. So, again, we're looking at these biotech practices, and we want to know, is this something we think is moral, ethical, something we should engage in, something we should use our tax dollars for? Again, is it a person designed to love and be loved? Or are we treating a person as an object, just as they did in Dred Scott? So you'll have issues like human cloning. The technical word for human cloning is somatic cell nuclear transfer. This little chart shows how Dolly the sheep was cloned. You all have heard of Dolly the sheep. And to quickly show you how that was done, normally there's half of the genetic material that comes from the sperm, half from the egg, right? Well, in cloning, you take a somatic cell. That just means a body cell. Each body cell has the full complement. So for human beings, it's 46 chromosomes. And if you took one of my skin cells and you took another woman and take her egg, take out the 26 from her egg and put my skin cell chromosome into her egg chromosome, you'd have little clone Dorinda, okay? And then you can either allow that to grow to the blastocyst stage and take out the embryonic stem cells to do experiments, or you could implant it into a third woman. Notice men are not needed for this experiment. Sorry, guys. And then try to bring that child to term. Of course, this would be human experimentation. But that was successfully done with Dolly. In Dolly, they used an udder cell. If you have an udder, that means you're a female sheep. And then they took an egg cell from this black-faced sheep, right? If you have eggs, you're a female. They fused those together. That's where the cloning occurs. You have a new sheep embryo. And then that embryo was implanted or transferred into the uterus of a third sheep, right? If this sheep has a uterus, this is also a female. And that is how Dolly the sheep was born. Of course, Dolly died of premature aging and other maladies. And so this is not something that we want to do with human beings, but people are talking about it. And animals such as monkeys have been cloned, and human embryos have been cloned, and the experiments terminated at day 14. So again, we're looking at issues like gestational surrogacy. The gestational surrogate is a woman who is hired, okay? If you go to fertility websites, they're called, we can procure a host uterus for you. Now, the host uterus is another woman. She has to be a mother already because she has to be a proven producer, so she'll have children at home. She's paid to become pregnant with the embryo created by IVF. That IVF embryo may be from the sperm and egg of the couple hiring her, or they could have hired someone to provide the eggs and someone else to provide the sperm. So like Dr. Chastik said, you can have up to 5 people. And then upon birth of this child, the surrogate relinquishes her rights as the mother and hands the child over to the so-called intended parents. I read an article as we were debating this issue in the Louisiana legislature, and we did end up taking the money out of it, where it's a criminal act to pay someone to be the host uterus, because what we call that is it's a form of reproductive trafficking. You're buying and selling women. It's a womb for rent, right? And then you're buying and selling the child. But the sad story of this article was that the surrogate mother, who had good intentions, wanted to help another family, she was also needy, and so these vulnerable populations of single mothers are taken advantage of. They often miscarry 1, 2, 3 times and put their own life at risk. But the thing that hurt her the most was that her 3-year-old asked her if she was going to be sold as well. That's what we're teaching our children when we do these kind of practices. This is what it looks like when you go to a broker website to hire the host uterus. It's literally a catalog where women are lined up like you're on Amazon.com, and you can pick out the woman to be your host uterus. Do we see commodification here? And then, once you've paid for this product, you don't want a defective product, do you? And so this is a situation that happened in the Northeast. The lawyer actually contacted us and we consulted on this case. But the child was found to have a cleft palate and a heart condition, and she was directed under the contract to abort the pregnancy. When she refused to do so, the lawyer sent a letter saying, okay, the couple is going to be generous and offer you $10,000 to have the abortion. She was a Christian woman. She needed the money. She agreed to do it. But then the day of the procedure, she said, I just can't do it. Well, of course, she got another letter from the lawyer threatening that her home would be taken, legal action would be taken. That's when we were brought into the case. And ultimately, this woman went to another state, I believe it was Michigan, where the laws there presume that the woman giving birth is the mother. And she gave birth to the child and placed the child for adoption. And so this is how messy, these good intentions, people want children, people want to help have children. These are all good and beautiful things. But when we start commodifying the reproductive process, we get caught in this buying, selling, defective product issue. And so look at that language from Dred Scott. She was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and trafficked wherever a profit could be made, right? And so by taking the money out of it here in Louisiana and in other states that we've worked with, you're taking the broker agency out and the brokers that put the women up on the website and so forth. Here in Louisiana, if you have a sister or a friend who's willing to do this for you without getting paid, then they're going to have to undergo those risks. But again, this is an illicit practice because it not only separates the loving act of the woman and the man being exclusive to that child, but it also endangers the life and the well-being of that woman. So let's talk about the abortion issue. Does abortion respect the dignity of the woman? Of course, we know that it doesn't respect the dignity of the child. The child is killed. We know that. But oftentimes, we don't think about the woman. And so is the woman in abortion treated as a person created to love and be loved? Or is she treated as an object who's just there to use and be used? Well, here's what the Supreme Court said. This is in its Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision, when they reaffirmed Roe in 1992. Here's what the court said. For 2 decades of economic and social developments, 2 decades. I have shoes that are older than 2 decades, right? But the court is going to say, here's the weight of our authority. For 20 years, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. So here's the court saying, well, we're not going to root it in the Constitution because we can't really find a place in the Constitution to root this. But for 20 years, people have been having sexual relations where they rely on abortion as a method of super birth control, right? It's birth control backup. This is not constitutional law. This is policy making from a radical feminist point of view. Here's also what they said. The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. Now, when this came out, I was out of law school just a couple of years. I graduated in 1990. I was a new mom. I was in a law practice. And so I asked myself, now, wait a minute, do I really think that to have a participation in the life of society, I need to be able to abort my children? So I asked myself, what did the suffragettes, the women who fought for the right to vote, what did they say about abortion, if anything? And so here's what I found out. Susan B. Anthony said of abortion, it will burden her conscience in life, it will burden her soul in death, but oh, thrice guilty is he who drove her to the desperation which impelled her to the crime. So we have Susan B. Anthony recognizing that abortion isn't about a woman's right, it's about the man in her life that should be protecting and providing for her, abandoning her, right? Her colleague, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, said, when we consider that women are treated as property and in the law, we were actually chattel. She said, it is degrading to women that we should treat our children as property to be disposed of as we see fit. And then my favorite is Alice Paul. She said abortion is the ultimate exploitation of women. Now, who's Alice Paul? She was the author of the first Equal Rights Amendment, which was designed to help women, after they obtained the right to vote, to have equal treatment in the workplace. It was later hijacked by an organization called the National Organization for Women, who made the ERA all about abortion. And who watches reruns of Everybody Loves Raymond? This is Patricia Heaton. She's the honorary chairwoman of Feminists for Life. She says every 36 seconds in America, a woman lays her body down, forced to choose abortion out of a lack of practical resources and emotional support. Abortion is a reflection that society has failed women. So there's the answer to your question. Love and be loved, or use and be used, right? Finally, Marianne Glendon, who is a Harvard law professor. She worked very closely with John Paul II. And she said to earlier feminists who had fought for the vote and for fair treatment in the workplace, it has seemed obvious that the ready availability of abortion would facilitate the sexual exploitation of women. So here you have, ladies and gentlemen, the roots of the Me Too movement. You know, you have in law, we have centuries of women saying, I'm not an object, I'm not made to be barefoot in the kitchen. I'm a human being. You know, I can have a child. I can have a voice in society, law, medicine, business, in the home, raising the family. But then here comes this decision, Roe versus Wade, which constitutionalizes the practice of killing unwanted children, which ends up making women into objects to use and be used, right? So are we surprised that the fruit of that is that men treat women as objects to use and be used? There's no consequences. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But if you look at this study from 1997, this woman went to, I think, 7 major cities in the United States, and she asked women who had had abortions why they had chosen abortion. She said, in the beginning, I assumed that women felt driven to abort because of material needs. You know, everyone says, oh, poor women don't have housing, don't have this. She said, far more significant were problems with relationships, particularly with the father of the child and the woman's parents. I discovered that in almost every case, a woman chooses abortion to accommodate the wishes of others who do not welcome her child. And so you see here the most common reasons. It's not because of a lack of physical resources, it's because the law of the gift has broken down into that eat or be eaten law of the jungle. The husband or the boyfriend pressured her to have an abortion. So much for the right to choose. The right to choose quickly became the right to coerce. Parents pressured the women. In 6 out of 7 cases was the mother. And so we have here evidence that abortion isn't a great constitutional right. It's wrong. It's just a wrong committed against a woman. And it hurts us not only emotionally, spiritually, but also physically. This was a meta-analysis which looked at a bunch of peer-reviewed studies and over a 30 or 40-year period. And it found that one abortion increases risks of major health problems, including preterm birth, breast cancer, and most shockingly, maternal suicide, increasing 3 to 6 times. That's 300 to 600% more likely to want to kill yourself after one abortion. Now, how many constitutional rights? The right to free speech, the right to assemble. How many practices of our constitutional rights make you suicidal? Okay? This shows you that we're outside of the Constitution and into the realm of a policy that hurts women and kills children and robs men of their vocation to protect and provide. So in a post-Roe world, you'll see countries like Australia here where we will have to say, look, abortion hurts women as well as killing men. And so if we're going to reverse Roe and have it in the states, we will have to be all hands on deck, right? So here's a few legislative policies that we have here in Louisiana and in several other states that reflect this law of the gift. And these type of things are a good intermediary method to get to the point of saying abortion is not just illegal, but it's unthinkable. It's something that I wouldn't want to choose for myself or for my loved one. Women's right to know laws, we'll talk about that in a moment. Funding pregnancy care centers, using the resources of the state to be there for women. Medicaid coverage for both the mother and the unborn child, recognizing that child as a person. Abortion clinics as rescue points for sex trafficking victims. We'll talk about that in a moment. Family-friendly work policies where you can have flexible hours for mothers of young children. Here in Louisiana, we prohibited Planned Parenthood and any other abortion provider. They're businesses, by the way. That's not a medical practice, it's a business. We prohibited them from teaching sex education in public and charter schools because people that sell abortion shouldn't be in a situation to drum up business, right, from our young people. And then last year, we did something called the Adoption Option Act, and that's where the state is going to, and we're working on a task force with the state to provide concrete, step-by-step, easy how-to information to help a woman that's in an abortion clinic consider how to make an adoption plan. And it'll be a little card that has a website attached to it. And it'll teach her, it'll combat the myth that if you choose adoption, your child will end up in the foster care system and abused and so forth. That is totally false. Women can now choose the family, choose a loving family. They can keep in touch with the child if they wish to. You know, you all know this, but women who are in a crisis situation need that 1, 2, 3. What are the adoption agencies here between Baton Rouge, diocese, or other private agencies across the state that can help you make a plan and have control so that your body doesn't have to undergo abortion and your child can be in a loving home that you're aware of. So another way to see law as the law of the gift is making abortion clinics into points of rescue for sex trafficking victims. We all know that sex trafficking is a big problem here in Louisiana, as in many places across the world. And so we worked with a legislator to require the posting of the National Human Trafficking Hotline in the outpatient abortion clinics on the handouts that are given to them, and giving them little information to screen to help them say, look, if you are the victim of trafficking, you won't be prosecuted. There's resources that we can help you with drug or alcohol addiction, job training, and so forth, and helping women that are in these situations rather than taking victims of trafficking and making them into the criminals. Also, we have the Signs of Hope. And this is booklets, and it's really informed consent for abortion. And it requires this signage to be up. And I want to show you what the sign says. This is the booklet that the woman must get, and she has to get this at least 24 hours before an abortion is performed. We just changed that in the Louisiana legislature to 72 hours, and of course, the abortion industry went straight to federal court, and that's currently in court. But the reason why the legislature wanted to change it from women having this information 24 hours beforehand to 72 hours is because that's the same amount of time that a woman can decide to place her child for adoption. You know, these decisions that are lifelong, irreversible decisions deserve a little time. And so you get this booklet that's created by the Department of Health in conjunction with the task force, and it shows the developing unborn child. It tells about the little physiological markers of what your baby's doing, tells you the methods of abortion and the medical risk to the woman's own health. And then the signage that's in the waiting room and each of the patient rooms says these common sense things. You can't be forced. You can't be forced, okay? It's unlawful for anyone to make you have an abortion against your will, even if you're a minor. You and the father of your child must provide support to the child, even if he has offered to pay for the abortion. You in adoption, the law allows adoptive parents to pay costs of prenatal care, childbirth, and newborn care. And finally, you are not alone. Again, this is a way for us to make a gift of ourselves through pregnancy care centers. Many agencies are willing and able to help you carry your child to term and to assist you after the child's birth. And so I want to close with these words of John Paul II, because abortion and many of these affect women disproportionately. So he said in this encyclical, The Gospel of Life, these words: "In transforming the culture so that it supports life, women occupy a place in thought and action which is unique and decisive. It depends on women to promote a new feminism which rejects the temptation of imitating models of male domination in order to acknowledge and affirm the true genius of women in every aspect of the life of society and overcome all discrimination, violence, and exploitation." Now, the law of the gift, in words like this of John Paul II, are echoed throughout Humanae Vitae. And so even though Humanae Vitae was about the regulation of births, these issues run throughout birth itself and afterbirth. And it doesn't affect just women. Here we have Erika Bachiochi in a wonderful book called Women, Sex, and the Church. She said, just as nature has both gifted and burdened women with the capacity to bear children, culture ought to both gift and burden men with the duties that come with begetting them. And so I want to close with this story. My son went to Jesuit high school, and at one of the mother-son breakfasts, they chose a young man to honor his mother. And he said these words that made me cry. He said, "We all know that behind every man for others is a mother who is for him," right? Because at Jesuit high schools and universities, the logo is men for others, right? People for others. That's the law of the gift, that we are here for one another. And so he said, for every man for others, there's a woman who is from him, a mother who is for him. And so our challenge in building a culture of life is that behind every woman for others is a father, a husband, or a male colleague who is for her, right? Abortion has been sold as a woman's issue for way too long. It's a human rights issue, right? This is a time for women to step up and for men to step up, for women to unapologetically nurture their children, and for men to unapologetically protect and provide for their wife and children as a family. Thank you all for being here. I'm always available. This is my contact information. Thanks once again. Take care.
Dorinda, thank you so much. The law of the gift versus the law of the jungle. Is a person an object? Is a human being a person or an object? And so thank you so much for all you do in Louisiana and in the states across the Union. I want to thank each of you for joining us today for this special day, this symposium as we go into and look into Humanae Vitae. And I guess I would just challenge each of you. Again, we'll get the PowerPoints on the website for the additional detail. But let me just end in the quote from Pope St. Paul VI, but from Humanae Vitae, his appeal to pastors and to bishops and to all of us: devote yourselves with all zeal and without delay to safeguarding the holiness of marriage, to guide married life to its full human and Christian perfection. Consider this mission as one of your most urgent responsibilities. Thank you.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, it was 50 years ago that Pope Paul VI bore courageous witness to the message of the sanctity of all human life. We thank you, Lord Jesus, for these prophetic words in the encyclical Humanae Vitae. And in a very special way today, we thank you for our 4 excellent speakers who with courage and with wisdom have shared this truth with us. Father Lloyd, Dr. Chasick, Dr. Hardy, Dorinda Boardley, we ask that you continue to lead and guide them in their work and in their mission. And we ask, too, Lord, your blessing upon this community of St. Agnes, Father Charbel, Kenneth Champagne, and all of those who have labored to bring this truth forth. We ask, too, the powerful intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who said yes to your will and to the gift of human life, and so brought us your incarnate Son. We ask, Lord, that you bless our coming together this day and make us instruments of truth, each in our own way, and bless the gift of food which we now receive. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.